Hey, guys, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you want to be a court jester? Too bad. No one wants to be a jester. It's not something you train for. It's something that happens to you, like the plague or being born left handed in a world of sorts. Most jesters didn't start out dreaming of juggling turnips in front of moody aristocrats. They were often chosen not for their ambition or resume, but because of something unique about them. You might have had a limp, hunchback, a high-pitched voice. Maybe you were unusually clever, unusually weird, or unusually short. Either way, someone important pointed and said that one. He's funny. Let's keep him. Congratulations. Your personality has been conscripted. Sometimes it started with a single joke. You made a noble laugh once at a feast, probably by accident. You slipped in the mud or mocked a rival baron just loud enough to be heard. The next morning, you're not back in your peasant hut. You're in a castle being handed a hat with bells and a new job description. Be entertaining forever. Other times you were purchased. Yes, bought. Lords sometimes collected jesters like they collected exotic animals or oversized goblets. If you were especially witty or weird looking, you might get gifted from one court to another like a party favor wrapped in sarcasm. You didn't apply to be a jester. You got chosen the way a chicken gets chosen for the stew pot, suddenly and without consultation. And from that moment on, your life was no longer your own. You were the designated laugh dispenser dragged out during feasts, summoned during tense political meetings, and paraded like a mascot when foreign diplomats came calling. You couldn't say no. You couldn't walk away. Not unless you wanted to return to the farm, or worse, get mistaken for a vagrant and end up in the stocks. Because in the medieval world, a man without a job, land, or purpose was just asking to be arrested for existing. So yes, in theory you're an entertainer, but in reality, you're a high-pressure, low-pay, full-time joke machine kept on retainer by people who can have you whipped for bad timing. And that's just how the audition worked. You may not be on stage with a spotlight, but make no mistake, in the medieval court, you're always performing. Being a jester isn't a job you clock into. It's your existence. You eat, sleep, and breathe among nobles, but you're never really one of them. You're their entertainment, their curiosity, their live-in what-if scenario, the court's emotional support oddity. You're not allowed to be invisible. Everyone sees you, and they expect something the moment they do. A joke, a twirl, a clever insult at someone else's expense. You are, in essence, the world's most exhausted novelty act, forever one smirk away from being called boring. Even when you're not officially summoned to perform, you're still being watched. Walking through the great hall. Better strut. Passing the queen's table at supper. Better wink or curtsy. Ironically, sitting alone in the corner for 5 seconds, someone will say, "Why isn't the fool being foolish?" And heaven forbid you show a real human emotion. Sadness that makes people uncomfortable. Anger. Dangerous. Quiet reflection. Suspicious. If you're not grinning like an idiot while half dancing on one foot, they assume you're planning treason. Worse still, you live in the palace, but not like a prince. You sleep somewhere near the kitchens, or tucked into a spare closet that used to house brooms. Your quarters are just close enough to hear all the laughter, but never be included in it. You eat what's left over. You wear what's given. You exist as a fixture of fun, not a person. And if someone important is bored or irritable, guess who gets summoned to fix it? You. If a nobleman's hunting party failed, if the wine cellar ran dry, if the king's favorite dog coughed weirdly, someone is coming to knock on your door at midnight with something amusing. You are not allowed to be. You are only allowed to entertain, which means the line between your true self and your persona gets so blurry you forget who you were before the bells and jokes and forced smiles in the medieval court. You don't just wear the costume. You are the costume. And trust me, the show never ends. Being a jester sounds fun until you realize you're required to be funny constantly. You don't get to be off. You don't get quiet days. You don't get to have moods. Your entire identity is expected to be one endless laugh track, no matter what else is going on in the world or your own life. Your job description. Be hilarious on demand. Even if the Duke just buried his third wife. Even if the kingdom is at war. Even if you woke up with a toothache and crushed morale. Doesn't matter. You're still expected to juggle, tell a pun, or fall flat on your face with grace. No pressure, right? And don't even think about reusing jokes. These are nobles, after all. They want fresh entertainment. That witty poem you worked on for a week. Great. Now do 12 more before lunch. And while you're at it, impersonate 3 courtiers, write a satire of the bishop's sermon, and pretend to trip on a goose now. And if you bomb, you're not just getting a bad Yelp review, you're getting jeered, slapped, possibly pelted with chicken bones, or worse, replaced. Medieval courts didn't have HR departments. If you fail to amuse the wrong person on the wrong day, your next gig might involve cleaning chamber pots or digging your own grave. And remember, you're the only one in the room not allowed to be serious. Everyone else can cry, rage, pray, scheme, or fall apart. You juggle through the tension. You laugh through royal tantrums. You dance around political intrigue with a stupid hat on your head and a forced smile on your face. And you can't say I'm not feeling it today. Feelings are irrelevant. Your entire value depends on how many chuckles you can wring from people who think sarcasm is foreplay and cruelty is wit. So yes, being the funny one sounds great in theory. But when your survival depends on your ability to entertain people who could legally execute you for a bad punchline, it's less stand-up comedy and more medieval emotional hostage-taking. In a medieval court, the line between funny and offensive is razor thin, and you're expected to tiptoe across it, blindfolded, juggling insults. As a jester, your job is to mock, tease, and comment on everything. Kings, queens, clergy, guests. But never too harshly, never too directly, and never at the wrong moment. One misplaced quip about the king's expanding waistline or the lord's fourth marriage, and suddenly you're not the funny man. You're the fool who crossed the line. And here's the real kicker. That line moves. On Monday, the queen laughs when you joke about her cousin's gambling habits. On Tuesday, he's in the room, and now it's treason. On Wednesday, she laughs again, but too hard, and the king looks displeased. On Thursday, you're being escorted out by guards for disturbing the peace of courtly decorum. There's no safe zone. Not really. Jokes about politics. Risky religion. Suicidal. Physical appearances. Very dangerous. Royal failures. Absolutely not. Unless you wrap it in 3 layers of metaphor and a juggling routine. Even then, maybe not. Some jesters developed an art of truth through absurdity, couching social criticism in riddles, double meanings, and animal metaphors. The rooster with the sharp tongue, and no eggs might want to crow less in the morning, you say, hoping the king laughs instead of orders your execution. But it's a gamble. Always. If the noble you mock is in a bad mood, that's your neck. If the bishop thinks your joke implies he's greedy, that's blasphemy. If the court turns against you, the same people who once roared with laughter will suddenly clutch their pearls and pretend they never found you amusing. And don't expect anyone to defend you. The jester isn't protected. You're not clergy. You're not nobility. You're a fool with a license to speak, a license that can be revoked with a single glare. Some jesters were whipped, some were banished, some were hanged, others were retired, which in medieval terms often meant buried without a funeral. So yes, humor was your weapon, but it was also your noose. And in court, timing was everything. Miss the beat. Lose your head. Before you even speak, the room is already laughing at what you're wearing. As a medieval jester, your wardrobe isn't made for dignity. It's made to humiliate. The moment you step into court, your entire outfit screams one thing. I'm not a person. I'm a punchline. Let's start with the hat. The famous coxcomb, a multicolored, flopping, horned monstrosity with bells attached to the tips. Bells. Not because it helps with your performance, but because people want to hear you coming like a walking wind chime of low self-worth. Your tunic. A checkerboard of clashing colors. No sane tailor would combine on purpose. Yellow and blue, red and green. bright garish patches sewn together like a tapestry made by someone who hates your dignity. Your shoes, curled toe slippers, also with bells, perfect for slipping on spilled meat or tripping over your own relevance. They make you look like a court-approved goblin, which frankly is the point. Even your belt is a joke, often oversized or knotted in ways that prevent practicality. Need to carry a knife or pouch? Forget it. That's not what you're here for. You're here to jiggle dance and fall on your face in a glorified mascot uniform. And while nobles wear velvet, silk, fur, and gold thread embroidery, their clothes are made from the cheapest scraps of wool and linen. If it's itchy, heavy, or stained, perfect. The worse it feels, the better it looks. The audience must always remember you're beneath them. Now imagine wearing this to every feast, every wedding, every royal negotiation. There's no variation, no wardrobe change, no formal gesture wear. You are visually ridiculous 24/7. Even when you're dead serious, you look like a coloring book exploded on your body and don't expect compliments. People don't say nice hats, they say. Try not to trip over your bells today, fool. Or worse, they tug your sleeve just to hear you jingle like a holiday decoration with abandonment issues. So yes, your clothes might be iconic, but they're also a uniform of humiliation. A reminder that even when your words are sharp, your outfit must be dull enough to reassure the powerful that you're never truly a threat. Just an echo in a funny hat. You sleep under the same roof as dukes, barons, and kings. But make no mistake, you're not one of them. You're part of the furniture, like a tapestry that makes noise. Your room, if you're lucky enough to have one, is a glorified storage closet tucked behind the kitchens or near the servants' quarters. A space just far enough to remind you you're not important, and just close enough to be dragged out at a moment's notice for a midnight joke or awkward wedding toast. At meals, you don't sit with the nobles. You stand near them, close enough to overhear gossip, be insulted mid-bite, or have a piece of chicken flung at your head in jest. You might be allowed to eat from the same platters, but always last, after the nobles, the priest, the dog, and occasionally the stable boy. And yet you hear everything. Affairs, plots, murmured insults, the truth behind marriages and treaties. You are the unwanted ear in the room, the one nobody stops talking around. Because in their minds, you're too lowly to matter. You're harmless, a fool. But that doesn't stop you from knowing everything. And sometimes that knowledge keeps you alive or gets you killed. The irony is cruel. You live among nobility. You know their secrets. You share their meals. But socially, you're stranded. The nobles won't befriend you. The servants won't trust you. You're too high for one world, too low for the other. Your presence is tolerated, but not respected. You're allowed into spaces peasants never see, but only so long as you're amusing. You're patted on the head like a performing animal, not welcomed like a guest. If you speak too plainly or ask for something real, a favor, protection, respect, you're reminded immediately. Know your place, fool. You are, quite literally, a resident outsider. You can mimic the court, mock the lords, entertain the ladies, but you'll never inherit land, marry into nobility, or wear a sword for honor. Your future is as fixed as your bells. So yes, you live with the nobles, but you live among them the way a shadow lives among light, always present, never truly visible. You've spent years honing your skills, juggling knives, reciting witty verse, playing instruments, mimicking voices, composing satire that could rival Cicero. And yet no one thinks of you as talented. They think of you as amusing. That's the curse of being a jester. No matter how much skill, creativity, or performance mastery you have, your genius is constantly treated like a party trick. You compose clever rhymes in multiple languages. They'll chuckle and say funny faces again. You craft a biting piece of political satire disguised as a joke about sheep. Someone throws a grape at your head and tells you not to get too clever. You're expected to be brilliant, but never acknowledged as such. If a noble sings a song, everyone applauds. If you sing better, the room goes silent. If a baron tells a joke, it's praised for its boldness. If you tell the same joke better, it's called sassy or inappropriate, and woe unto you if you actually outshine someone important. Nobles don't like being upstaged, especially by someone dressed like a Christmas ornament. You're supposed to sparkle, not eclipse, so you play a strange game, perform just well enough to keep your job, but not so well that you make anyone feel inferior. Be witty, but not wise. Be sharp, but not threatening. Be brilliant, and then immediately juggle something to remind everyone you're not that clever. It's a balancing act on the edge of a sword. And here's the real tragedy. Many jesters were incredibly skilled. Musicians, acrobats, poets, political thinkers, all hiding behind a mask of idiocy because brilliance in a fool's mouth is only tolerated if it comes with a pratfall and a jingle. You know what's worse? They laugh hardest when you mess up. Miss a joke. Trip mid-dance. Drop a loop. That's when they roar. Not because you meant to, but because failure reinforces what they want to believe. That you're just an idiot in a loud outfit, not someone clever enough to mock them in their own tongue. So yes, your talent may be the most refined in the room, but your applause? It only ever comes wrapped in condescension. Feasts in a medieval court are grand. Glistening roasts, overflowing wine goblets, minstrels plucking away in the background. It's a festival of excess. And you're the main course of humiliation. From the moment guests arrive, nobles are eyeing you like a toy. They can poke for laughs. Do a trick, fool. Tell a joke. Imitate Lord Winsley and his lazy eye. You perform not because you want to, but because the mood of 100 powerful drunken nobles depends on your ability to not take offense while being publicly mocked, grabbed, teased, and possibly slapped. You don't sit at the table. You orbit it like a bright, jingly satellite of shame. You move from group to group like a courtly Roomba, cleaning up awkward silences with a clever line or a badly timed handstand. You are always available, but never invited. And when the wine starts flowing heavily, that's when things turn. Suddenly, your performance becomes a game for everyone else. Someone pulls your hat down over your eyes. Another demands a pig impression. Someone else throws a leg bone at you and laughs when you flinch. Because here's the thing. You're not just entertainment. You're a social punching bag, a safety valve for the elite. Nobles can't insult each other, but they can insult you. And they do. Constantly. They mock your clothes, your voice, your background, your worth. Not because they hate you, but because you're convenient. Because laughing at the jester makes everyone feel smarter, richer, and safer. You're the joke that keeps the system in balance. You smile, you take it. You keep the laughter going because the alternative is silence. And in the medieval court, silence is dangerous. Silence means tension. Silence means attention shifts, and you do not want the spotlight to land on someone more important than you and find you unfunny in the process. So yes, you're at every feast, but you're not celebrated. You're consumed like the bread and wine swallowed and forgotten by the time the goblets are cleared. And when everyone goes to bed full and satisfied, you go back to your closet-sized room with bruised ribs and a sore smile. By day, you're a jester, flinging jokes, juggling apples, and taking verbal punches like a trained clown in a velvet cage. But by night, you're a weapon. The crowd might laugh at your tumbling act, but they know your real value isn't in your slapstick. It's in your ears. You see, being a fool comes with a strange perk. You're invisible in plain sight. Nobles speak freely around you. Servants forget you're there. Guests vent their frustrations while you pour their wine. You drift from corner to corner like furniture, with feet catching everything. You hear confessions that weren't meant to be heard, treason whispered between cousins, affairs confessed over goblets, bribes, threats, alliances forming in the shade of the feast. And you remember it all, not because you're nosy, but because it keeps you alive. Because sometimes the king calls you aside. He says, "Fool, tell me what the bishop said to the French envoy last night, and you'd better have the answer. If you don't, he might think you're loyal to someone else. If you do, he might ask for more." This is a terrible dance. The king wants truth from your lips, but no truth that implicates him. You serve a monarch who praises your honesty until your honesty offends. You're expected to report quietly, cleverly, maybe even in riddle form. Who's sleeping with whose wife, or who's plotting a little light rebellion over stew. You're the court's most dangerous informant, disguised as the least dangerous person in the room. But there's a catch. Everyone else knows it. The lords and ladies smile at you, but they don't trust you. Servants stop talking when you walk by. The guards eye you like you're holding a dagger behind your back. And in a way, you are. Your weapon is information, and information in a medieval court is just a sharp joke away from being deadly. So you're always listening, always choosing which truth to tell and which one to bury under a harmless punchline. Because in a world full of swords and secrets, the most dangerous blade isn't forged from steel. It's tucked behind a fool's grin. In the medieval court, your job is to keep everyone else laughing. Even when you're falling apart inside, your dog dies. Doesn't matter. The queen still expects you to make a joke about her cousin's wig. You've got a fever. Too bad. The duke had a bad hunting day, and he needs a laugh before he throws his plate. Your heart's broken. Keep dancing, fool. This is a wedding. You're not allowed to have feelings unless they're funny ones. Sadness. That's selfish. Anger. Insubordination. Fatigue, laziness. Anything short of cheerful absurdity is treated like a betrayal. If you show real emotion, people get uncomfortable. Not because they care, but because you're failing your function. They don't see you as a person with a soul and scars. They see you as court furniture with jokes. You're expected to absorb everyone else's moods and reflect none of your own. You must sit through drunken tirades, mocking laughter, passive-aggressive insults, and the occasional flying chicken leg, and smile through it all. Sometimes you perform while grieving. Sometimes you perform while ill. Sometimes you perform while quietly begging the universe to just let you disappear behind a curtain and cry for 5 blessed minutes. But there's no curtain, no privacy. You're always on, and the idea of vulnerability doesn't fit your costume. And here's the cruelest twist. When nobles do notice you're down, they don't ask what's wrong. They say, "Why aren't you being funny today?" Or worse, "Maybe the fool's finally lost it. Shall we find a new one?" So what do you turn your pain into performance? You make your heart break a punchline. You laugh first and louder before they can. You build a fortress of wit around your exhaustion, and you don't let anyone see inside. Because the moment they realize the fool is human, the illusion shatters. And so does your job. So yes, you had feelings. You just learned to bury them under bells and jokes like everyone expected. Because in the court, when everyone else gets to feel things, the fool is the one who pretends nothing hurts. Medieval kings were not known for emotional stability. One bad dream, one spoiled roast, one poorly timed sneeze from a foreign diplomat, and the entire mood of the court shifts like a thunder cloud with a crown. And guess who they all look at when the king furrows his brow or frowns into his goblet? You. Because if the monarch isn't smiling, clearly the fool isn't doing his job. It doesn't matter that you were up late performing at a feast, or that your voice is hoarse from singing, or that you told 12 jokes this morning that got genuine chuckles from 3 nights and a cook if the king wakes up irritable. The court looks at you like you personally ruined breakfast. You're not just the jester. You're the court's emotional insurance policy. Did a trade negotiation fail? The king's advisors mutter. Perhaps the fool didn't lighten the tension enough. Did the queen scowl during mass? Maybe the jester made a joke in poor taste. Did the king stub his toe on a chamber pot? Has the fool been leaving things about again? Sometimes it's subtle, a snide comment, a disapproving glare. Other times it's direct. Entertain me, fool. I'm in a foul mood and your head's in the balance. And they're not kidding. You're one ill-timed silence away from being demoted to stable, cleaner, or worse, executed for being unfunny. And even when it's not your fault, it becomes your burden. You must fix the mood, patch the tension. Make the royal toddler laugh so no one notices the king just broke a goblet over the steward's head. You become a human emotional thermostat, adjusting yourself endlessly so everyone else stays warm and content. But here's the thing. No one ever thanks you. If the king's mood improves, it's because his wine was strong. If he laughs, it's because someone told him a joke earlier, not you. If he doesn't laugh, you're at fault. Either way, you lose. So yes, in a court of paranoia and politics, you, the jester, are somehow both irrelevant and responsible for the mood of the most powerful man in the kingdom. And if he doesn't laugh, you'd better start praying. You may live in the castle, wear bells on your hat, and share jokes with kings, but make no mistake, you are not free. In fact, you're more trapped than most, because being a medieval court jester isn't just a job, it's an identity that consumes you. Once you're labeled a fool, that's it. There's no promotion, no career change. No, I like to try something different. You're a lifelong performer, whether you want to be or not. It doesn't matter if you're aging, tired, or sick. You don't get to retire. There's no pension, no cozy cottage waiting at the edge of the kingdom. You don't become a merchant or a monk or a respected elder. You're not a master, whatever your name is. You're still a fool. Just slower, sadder, and with fewer teeth. And the worst part, even if you're brilliant, no one will ever see past the hat. You might write poetry. You might speak 4 languages. You might secretly know more about statecraft than the royal council. But when you speak, everyone hears bells and expects pratfalls. You could warn of war and be ignored, but if you slip on a turnip, they'll laugh for hours. You become a costume with a voice and try leaving. Good luck. You're not trained in a trade. You own no land. You have no connections outside the castle walls. If you wander into a town, you're not seen as that sharp-witted court performer. You're just a strange, poorly dressed man babbling about dukes and drama, probably mistaken for a madman or vagrant. And if you do leave and somehow survive, what then? You'll miss meals. You'll be forgotten, and sooner or later, some lesser noble will say, "Bring back the old fool. He made us laugh." And just like that, you're dragged back in because you're not a man. You're an object that people remember when they're bored. So you stay, you perform. You laugh at your own pain because the alternative is terrifying. Because once you're the fool, you stay the fool forever. Here's the strange thing about being a fool. In a room full of nobles, bishops, and knights, you might be the only one allowed to speak the truth. Everyone else in court speaks in riddles. Diplomats flatter, courtiers scheme. Servants lie to survive. But you got one strange, dangerous privilege. You can say what others can't. You can mock a policy the king refuses to reconsider. You can whisper jokes that call out corruption. You can impersonate the baron who's clearly embezzling grain, or the duchess with a suspiciously close friendship to the bishop's nephew and somehow get away with it. But let's be clear, getting away with it doesn't mean you're safe. It means you're walking a high wire strung between comedy and execution. The court laughs because they're pretending it's just a joke. But you know the truth. It's never just a joke. That jest about the war, that's a political opinion in disguise. That pun about the taxes, that's public dissent, delicately wrapped in wordplay. You are the only honest voice in the room, and everyone knows it. And that scares them. Some will admire you quietly. Others will hate you openly. But all will watch your every word because one misstep, one joke too sharp, one truth too close, and the same crown that once chuckled at your cleverness may have your head rolling across the tiles by morning. In a world where saying the wrong thing could get anyone imprisoned, the jester was the court's built-in truth serum, but with no protection. You are the moral mirror, the court's conscience and bells. You're allowed to point at the naked emperor, so long as you do it with a backflip and a silly voice. But if your truth cuts too deep, or if the king is in a particularly fragile mood, well, jesters have been silenced before. So yes, in a court built on secrets, your job is to shine a flickering lantern into the shadows and pretend it's a spotlight gag. Because sometimes the only one brave enough to speak the truth is the man everyone refuses to take seriously. You spend your life surrounded by people, nobles, knights, ladies, guests. You entertain at feasts, weddings, coronations, and even funerals. Your voice echoes in great halls. Your jokes fill chambers with laughter. And yet, when your time comes, no one is there. The jester's life is filled with noise, but his death is usually silent. You die in a corner room, unnoticed, unmourned. No parade, no eulogy, no marble slab etched with your cleverest line. You don't get remembered like a knight or a bard. You're not written into songs or family histories. You're just gone. Maybe the cook mentions you once, years later. Remember that fool who used to dance like a goat? Maybe a new jester finds your old bells in a drawer and doesn't ask whose they were. Or maybe no one remembers you at all because someone else took your place before your bed even went cold. Because you weren't a person to them. Not really. You were a sound, a color, a flicker of amusement, replaceable, disposable, and the very thing that made you valuable. Your ability to disappear behind a joke is the same thing that ensures you're forgotten. You never marry. You never have heirs. You never own land or build a name. You make everyone else feel important, but you leave no legacy of your own. Even your closest friend in court, the steward who once laughed at your imitation of the bishop, won't visit your grave. You might be buried outside the churchyard because fools weren't considered holy enough for consecrated ground. Too many jokes, not enough prayers. You lived for their laughter. You measured your worth in their joy. But laughter is fleeting. It echoes once and fades. And when you're gone, the halls grow quiet until the next fool arrives, juggling for applause. So yes, your life brought others cheer. You made kings forget their worries and lords drop their pride. But when your candle finally burns out, there's no crowd, no fanfare, just silence. And maybe, just maybe, the soft jingle of bells remembered by no one. To the lords and ladies of the medieval court, the jester was entertainment, comic relief in a tense world of politics, war, and ceremony. But look closer, and you'll see the jester wasn't just there to amuse. He was there to remind me. He was a walking contradiction, low-born yet allowed to mock kings, powerless yet speaking truth to power, ridiculed yet feared. He stood at the center of the feast, jingling and spinning, not to be celebrated, but to be studied, because the jester was a mirror. His jokes revealed things no one else dared to say. His puns disguised political commentary. His mimicry revealed hypocrisy. And every time he made the room laugh, he also made it squirm, because somewhere in the slapstick there was always a sliver of truth. The fool was safe to laugh at until he wasn't, until he pointed out too much, until the room realized this man in bells and rags understands us better than we'd like. And so he became more than a performer. He became a symbol, a reminder that power is fragile, that truth, even dressed in comedy, can be dangerous. That laughter is a weapon, one that can cut deeper than any sword. In a world obsessed with order and hierarchy, the jester was the exception, and that's what made him so necessary. He walked the halls of power not because he was respected, but because he reminded the powerful of what they feared most: being ridiculous, being exposed, being human. But the joke in the end was never truly about the nobles. It was on him. He sacrificed dignity, freedom, legacy, and peace of mind for the fleeting approval of people who would never see him as an equal. His genius was hidden beneath absurdity, his wisdom wrapped in wordplay, his truth dismissed as foolishness. And yet, centuries later, we still remember him. Not as a clown, but as something more complex, more haunting, more real. The medieval jester was not a joke. He was a warning that sometimes the only one telling the truth is the one you're busy laughing at. Long before curtains rose and actors bowed, ancient theater was born in a swirl of wine, masks, and divine chaos. It didn't start with playwrights or applause. It began with Dionysus, the Greek god of wine, fertility, ritual madness, and performance. In 6th century BCE Athens, theater wasn't just culture, it was cult. The earliest dramas emerged during the city Dionysia, a spring festival honoring the god himself. Citizens flooded the city in celebration. Livestock was sacrificed. Wine flowed like rivers, and in the midst of this revelry, something miraculous happened. People started acting, not pretending, but becoming, taking on voices not their own, dancing in frenzied circles, chanting choruses that blurred the line between prayer and performance. The centerpiece, a dithyramb, a wild, hymn-like chant performed by a chorus of up to 50 men, moving in rhythm, faces masked, eyes aflame with ecstasy. These weren't actors as we know them. They were vessels, mediums, each voice a drop in the divine pool of Dionysian energy. Then came a man named Thespis. Legend says Thespis stepped out from the chorus around 534 BCE and spoke as a character rather than as part of a group. Just like that, the concept of an actor was born. That's why we still call performers thespians today. Imagine it, one man alone on stage, claiming to be someone else. It must have felt like blasphemy or magic. The Greeks were hooked. What began as a sacred ritual started evolving into structured performance. Playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles would soon refine it further, adding a second and third actor, introducing dialogue, plot, and the idea of dramatic conflict. But the spiritual core never left. These early performances took place in massive open-air theaters carved into hillsides, most famously the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. It could hold up to 17,000 spectators, all gathered in a semicircle to witness something that straddled religion, art, and civic duty. So no, theater didn't start in silence. It arrived loud, masked, drenched in wine, and fueled by gods. The stage wasn't just a place to pretend, it was a portal to myth, madness, and meaning. And it all started with a need to celebrate something bigger than ourselves. Welcome to the stage. As Greek theater matured, it became more than divine devotion. It became a mirror through which Athenians could see their own fears, failures, and fleeting glories reflected under the Mediterranean sun. But to truly understand that mirror, we have to talk about two things: tragedy and masks. Tragedy, or tragoidia, literally goat song, is a word that still echoes in modern storytelling, but origins are hazy and strange. It might refer to goats sacrificed to Dionysus, or perhaps the prize, a goat awarded to the best performer. Either way, by the 5th century BCE, tragedy had crystallized into a formal art. The plays were structured, poetic, and overwhelmingly fatal. Think fate, betrayal, vengeance, hubris, and gods who toyed with mortals like cats play with mice. And at the center of it all were masks. Greek actors didn't just play roles, they transformed. Each actor, typically male, could portray multiple characters using distinct masks. A twisted mouth for sorrow, a wide-eyed face of fear, a delicate feminine mask for goddesses and queens. These masks weren't subtle. They were oversized, stylized, and often exaggerated, so even the person in the worst seat at the top of the amphitheater could feel the character's emotion. Behind the mask, the actor's voice was everything. Projection and clarity mattered more than naturalism. With no microphones or lighting, actors had to command a sea of thousands, using nothing but breath, tone, and precise physicality. One actor might kneel in grief. Another might howl into the sky, all of it unfolding beneath the open heavens. Tragedians like Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides revolutionized the form. Aeschylus added a second actor, Sophocles 3, and Euripides brought psychological depth and raw emotion that made his characters bleed on the page. They tackled themes of divine injustice or trauma and the limits of human reason. Oedipus, Antigone, Medea. These weren't just plays. They were philosophical battlegrounds. And yet, despite all this darkness, Greek theater wasn't a funeral. It was a civic celebration. Tragedies were performed competitively, like Olympic Games for the soul. The entire city would attend, including the poor. Wealthy citizens even paid for the production as a form of public service. The stage had become sacred ground and the mosque, a tool of revelation. The Greeks had found a way to stare into chaos and call it art. While tragedy grappled with gods and doom, Greek comedy pulled down its tunic and mooned the universe. By the late 5th century BCE, as Athens blossomed into a cultural and intellectual superpower, comedy emerged as its rebellious younger sibling. It was raw, irreverent, and loud. A theatrical playground where no one, not even the gods, was safe from ridicule. If tragedy is asked, what is the meaning of suffering? Comedy asked, why is Zeus such a pompous idiot? The master of this art was Aristophanes, the Shakespeare of satire. His plays like Lysistrata, The Clouds, and The Frogs were brilliant, bawdy, and biting. Lysistrata, for example, tells of women who withhold sex to force their men to stop waging war. It was revolutionary, hilarious, and politically loaded. Imagine watching a play where the characters are making fun of your government, your neighbors, and your own bad habits, and everyone's laughing in the open. Comedy plays were still part of religious festivals, like the city Dionysia, often performed right after the tragic trilogies. The audience would go from crying over Antigone to roaring with laughter as a chorus of dancing sausages mocked corrupt politicians. Masks in comedy were even more exaggerated than those in tragedy. Grotesque faces with bulging eyes, snub noses, and enormous ahem male appendages to guarantee laughter even from the back row. Costumes were padded, wigs were wild, and the chorus might show up as frogs, wasps, birds, or clouds, depending on the joke. But Greek comedy wasn't all slapstick. It was deeply political. Aristophanes attacked warmongers, philosophers, and playwrights with surgical precision. The clouds mocked Socrates so ruthlessly that some scholars believe it contributed to the public mistrust that eventually led to his trial. As the classical age matured, comedy evolved. New comedy, in the 4th century BC, softened the satire and focused on domestic plots, mistaken identities, romantic entanglements, clever slaves outwitting dim-witted masters. Playwrights like Menander laid the groundwork for what would later influence Roman comedies and even modern sitcoms. Greek comedy was more than laughter. It was truth-telling in disguise, a democratic city speaking to itself in riddles and punch-lines, masks and music. Dance and defiance where tragedy asked, "What is fate?" Comedy replied, "Isn't it ridiculous how we try to control it?" When the Romans inherited the stage from the Greeks, they didn't whisper tragedy into the wind. They built colossal amphitheaters, stuffed them with thousands of spectators, and said, "Let's make it louder." Theater in ancient Rome was never just about art. It was about power, performance, and pleasing the masses. The earliest Roman plays were translations of Greek works adapted by playwrights like Livius Andronicus and Plautus, who Romanized the humor, dialed up the physical gags, and simplified the plots for wider appeal. The result? Theater that was rowdy, fast-paced, and obsessed with mistaken identity, lewd jokes, and ridiculous characters who always ended up running in circles. Plautus and his successor Terence are remembered for refining Roman comedy, turning it into a genre of clever slaves, clueless lovers, and fathers in crisis, characters that would become templates for Western comedy for centuries. Their plays didn't just entertain. They poked fun at Roman society's absurdities, snobbery, greed, social climbing, and hypocrisy. But Roman tragedy was a different beast. While Greek tragedies were philosophical and poetic, Roman tragedies, especially those of Seneca, were intense, violent, and sometimes downright disturbing. Seneca's Thyestes, for example, features a scene where a man unknowingly eats his own children. Not exactly a night of light entertainment. Seneca's influence, however, wouldn't peak until much later. In his own time, Roman tragedy played second fiddle to what truly won the public's favor: spectacle. Romans loved blood, noise, and grandeur. Theater often competed with chariot races and gladiator fights, so playwrights and producers upped the drama, literally. Staging was lavish. Some productions featured trapdoors, cranes, and even water effects. Music was everywhere, often drowning out the dialogue. Actors wore masks similar to the Greeks, but their performances leaned more on exaggerated gesture than nuanced emotion. And in some extreme cases, deaths on stage weren't acted out. They were real executions woven into the story. That's Rome for you. For emperors, the theater also became a tool of propaganda. Augustus and Nero used it to promote imperial ideology. Nero, in fact, fancied himself an actor and forced audiences to sit through his endless performances or risk execution for walking out. In Rome, the stage was a battleground for attention, glory, and influence. Less sacred than Greek theater, but far more sensational. It was no longer about catharsis, it was about control. Far from the marble stages of Greece and the booming arenas of Rome, a different form of theater blossomed in ancient India, one that was rich in spirituality, philosophy, and refined aesthetics. Indian theater wasn't born in festivals of wine, but in the quiet depths of sacred texts and oral tradition. Its foundation lies in the Natya Shastra, an ancient Sanskrit treatise on drama attributed to the sage Parata, dated somewhere between 200 BCE and 200 CE. This wasn't just a manual on performance, it was a cosmic blueprint. According to the text, theater was created by the gods as a divine offering to humanity, a way to educate, entertain, and uplift the soul. The Natya Shastra outlines everything: stage construction, character types, gestures, facial expressions, music, and even the psychological effects of drama. It emphasizes rasa, the emotional essence evoked in the audience. Whether it's Sringara, romantic love, karuna, compassion, or raudra, fury, each play aims to stir the soul and guide it toward enlightenment. Performances were elaborate, yet disciplined. Actors trained for years in voice movement and mudras, codified hand gestures used to express meaning without words. Dialogue was often sung or chanted, and stories came from epic texts like the Mahabharata and Ramayana, weaving together mythology, morality, and magic. One of the earliest known playwrights was Kalidasa, whose drama Shakuntala still stands as a masterpiece of world literature. His works weren't just popular, they were revered. Audiences expected to be moved emotionally and spiritually. They came not just for a story, but for a refined experience of being. Theater in India was inclusive in an entirely different sense. While elite courts often sponsor performances, folk traditions also flourished. Sanskrit theater existed alongside regional village drama, puppet theater, and dance drama forms like Kathakali and Yakshagana, each with its own rules, costumes, and musical rhythms. Unlike in Rome, where the goal was spectacle, or in Greece, where the aim was civic reflection, Indian theater sought to harmonize, to balance emotion, intellect, and spirit. It was both performance and prayer, art and dharma in this world of silks, incense, and layered symbols. The actor wasn't just an entertainer. They were a spiritual vessel, bridging myth and reality, embodying the timeless stories that made sense of life and death. In ancient China, theater didn't erupt into existence. It unfolded like a delicate fan over centuries of music, dance, and ritual. Before there were scripts and actors, there were shamans, court performers, and sacred ceremonies blending movement with meaning. Chinese theatrical roots stretch back over 3,000 years to the Zhou dynasty, when masked dances known as Nuo were performed to ward off evil spirits. These weren't for laughs, they were solemn spiritual affairs. Over time, these rituals evolved, absorbing elements of storytelling, mime, and music. By the Tang Dynasty, 7th, 10th century CE, a true theatrical form was taking shape, one that balanced aesthetics, discipline, and philosophy. The Tang court under Emperor Xuanzong even established the Pear Garden, the first known royal acting academy. Actors trained in voice, dance, acrobatics, and gesture. It's no wonder that performers in traditional Chinese theater are still called children of the Pear Garden today. But it was during the Yuan dynasty, 13th-14th century, that Chinese drama truly bloomed under Mongol rule. Confucian censorship loosened and popular entertainment surged. Zaju, a genre of poetic drama, rose in prominence. It featured structured arias, comic interludes, and strong female leads, sometimes played by actual women, a rarity in global theater history. Enter Guan Hanqing, the Yuan playwright often compared to Shakespeare. His works, like The Injustice to Do Ye, were packed with emotional depth, social critique, and lyrical beauty. They told stories of unjust rulers, moral dilemmas, and tragic heroines, with performances relying on symbolic gesture, stylized movement, and minimal scenery. The audience was expected to read the body as much as hear the words. From these roots came Chinese opera, a rich and dazzling tradition that fully emerged by the Ming and Qing dynasties, the most famous form Peking opera. Or Jingju crystallized in the 18th century with ornate costumes, color-coded makeup, martial arts, and piercing falsetto voices. It turned performance into a ritualized visual language. Each movement, raising a sleeve, tilting the head, was loaded with meaning. The stage was almost bare, yet your imagination filled it with mountains, palaces, and battlefields, and unlike Western theater, Chinese opera didn't aim for realism, it aimed for essence. Chinese theater didn't just tell stories. It transmitted values, preserved history, and expressed a worldview where heaven, earth, and humanity danced in quiet harmony. In Japan, theater emerged not with clamor or excess, but with stillness, subtlety, and sacred restraint among the world's oldest surviving theatrical forms. No is unlike anything that came before or after. Born in the 14th century, No was less a performance for the masses and more a ritual for the refined soul, a whisper of drama in a world obsessed with noise. No traces its lineage to Dengaku and Suragaku, folk dances, Buddhist chants, and comic sketches that entertained both commoners and monks. But in the 1300s, a father-son duo changed everything. Kanami and his son Xiami elevated No into a structured, poetic, and deeply symbolic art form. Xiami, a performer, writer, and theorist, gave No its heart. His treatises laid down a philosophy of beauty rooted in Yugen, a kind of mysterious grace or profound subtlety. And No, less wasn't just more, it was everything. Each performance blends music, dance, poetry, and drama into a single fluid expression. Actors move slowly, deliberately, often appearing more like statues than performers. Dialogue is sung or chanted, accompanied by a small ensemble of flute and drums. There is no illusion of realism. Instead, the experience is dreamlike, more like witnessing a ghost story told from within the ghost. And speaking of ghosts, many plays are literally about spirits, dead warriors, lost lovers, mad women. And wandering monks are frequent characters. These are not action-packed stories, but meditations on memory, loss, and longing. The main actor, or Shite, typically wears a carved wooden mask, frozen in an expression that shifts subtly with the angle of the head or light. These masks are sacred objects, not props. The nose stage is minimal, just a bare wooden platform with a painted pine tree backdrop. Yet this simplicity is deceptive. Every element, from the shuffle of the actor's feet to the rustle of silk robes, is choreographed to evoke the spiritual beneath the surface. Time seems to slow. The mundane dissolves. Supported and patronized by the samurai class, No became an aristocratic art. It wasn't made for cheering crowds. It was for introspection, for connection to something eternal. Even today, performances remain largely unchanged from 600 years ago. In No, the stage becomes a threshold between worlds, life and death, form and void, voice and silence. While grand stages and noble actors stole the spotlight in many cultures, another kind of theater quietly thrived in the shadows. Puppet theater. In Asia especially, puppetry wasn't just child's play. It was a powerful medium for myth, morality, and memory, where the inanimate whispered truths the living dared not say. In Indonesia, particularly Java and Bali, the ancient art of wayang kulit shadow puppetry emerged as a sacred tradition. Thin, flat puppets made from buffalo hide were intricately carved and painted, then held behind a white screen with a flickering oil lamp. The result? Silhouettes dancing in flickering light, conjuring entire worlds from shadow. At the center of it all was the Dung, the puppet master. Far more than a performer, the Dalong was a spiritual guide, comedian, narrator, and philosopher rolled into one. With a single voice, he portrayed dozens of characters from Hindu epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana. The stories might last for hours, even through the night. Accompanied by the rhythmic pulse of a gamelan orchestra, wayang wasn't just entertainment. It was a ritual act, often performed during temple festivals, births, funerals, or political ceremonies. Each puppet symbolized more than a character. It was a force, a lesson, a karmic echo. Meanwhile, in Japan, another mesmerizing form evolved, bunraku. Unlike wayang silhouettes, bunraku puppets are large, lifelike, and manipulated by three puppeteers in full view of the audience. One controls the head and right arm, another the left arm, and the third the legs. It takes years of training before a puppeteer can even touch the puppet's head. The result? Uncanny realism. A puppet woman tugs her sleeve in heartbreak. A warrior trembles before death. It's mesmerizing. The narration, however, is delivered by a single chanter seated beside a shamisen player. His voice becomes thunder, tears, whispers, rage. The puppets move, but the soul comes from his throat. Puppetry thrived precisely because it could say what humans couldn't. In strict societies, puppets mocked emperors, questioned fate, and explored forbidden love or vengeance without retribution. After all, it wasn't a man accusing the king. It was just a doll. Whether in flickering shadows or under full lantern light, puppet theater turned wood and string into mirrors, reflecting the deepest fears, dreams, and truths of the cultures that created them. From the drunken chants of Dionysus to the silent grace of no masks, ancient theater didn't simply vanish. It echoed forward, reshaping how we tell stories even today. Its legacy isn't just etched in stone ruins or dusty scrolls. It's alive in every stage, screen, and script. The Greeks gave us structure. Their innovations, dialogue, dramatic conflict, character arcs are the very bones of modern storytelling. The three acts play. That's Aeschylus whispering through time, the tragic hero undone by hubris, straight from Sophocles, even the concept of a fourth wall. That invisible boundary between actor and audience was something the Greeks played with centuries ago. The Romans, for all their love of spectacle, passed down a different inheritance, theater as mass entertainment. Their open-air amphitheaters became the architectural model for everything from Shakespeare's Globe to modern sports arenas, and their comedies, full of farce, mistaken identities, and bawdy misunderstandings, laid the groundwork for Western sitcoms and slapstick. In the East, the impact of theater is no less profound. Indian drama, with its focus on emotional resonance and the balance of aesthetic moods, Raza influenced not just performance, but classical dance, cinema, and poetry. The philosophical weight of the Natya Shastra continues to inform Indian storytelling today. Chinese opera, with its color-coded symbolism and stylized expression, inspired centuries of visual storytelling. Even martial arts cinema owes much to the rhythmic, choreographed combat of opera performers. Meanwhile, Japan's No and Bunraku remain living traditions, still performed, still revered, their minimalism influencing modern directors like Kurosawa and even Western experimental theater. And the puppets? They've multiplied, from shadow plays in Southeast Asia to digital avatars on TikTok. The idea of animating the inanimate remains irresistible. Puppetry's ability to distill emotion into pure gesture has influenced everything from children's television to avant-garde performance art. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of ancient theater is this. The human needs to perform, to watch and be watched, to slip into another's skin and return changed. Every ritual, every meme, every monologue on a dim-lit stage is part of that same lineage, a search for meaning through motion, mask, and voice. So the next time you see a play, a film, or a TikTok skit, remember you're witnessing not just entertainment, but a sacred echo. Theater may have evolved, but it has never stopped being our oldest and most honest mirror. Sanain was born into a world where bloodlines were everything, and hers was sharp as a sword. Her father was Philip II of Macedon, the man who turned a fractured kingdom into a military machine. Her mother was Ordata, an Illyrian princess from a fierce warrior tribe to the west. Most Macedonian princesses were groomed for alliances and silk-draped diplomacy. But Sanain, she was raised for war. From the moment she could walk, Sanain lived under the weight of two powerful legacies: the tactical brilliance of her father and the unbreakable spirit of her Illyrian mother. While other royal girls were learning to weave, she was learning to wield a spear. Odata, unlike most Macedonian queens, didn't just tolerate this. She trained her daughter herself. In Illyrian culture, women could fight alongside men. Strength wasn't just admired, it was expected. Sanain's early life was steeped in discipline. She rode horses across jagged terrain, practiced swordplay in the heat of the day, and studied the movements of armies instead of embroidery patterns. In the palace of Agai, where her father plotted conquests, Sanain absorbed everything. She listened at the edges of war councils, watched how generals deferred to Philip, and understood far too early that power was a given. It had to be taken. Being Philip's daughter came with advantages, but also danger. Her half-brother Alexander, born to Olympias, would become the center of Philip's world. The court buzzed with ambition, rivalry, and suspicion. Macedon wasn't a peaceful place, even at its peak. Murders, exiles, shifting alliances. This was her childhood. But Sanain was no passive observer. Even as a girl, she cultivated presence. She trained harder, spoke more boldly, and rode faster. She knew her name would never be Alexander, but she could still carve her own legacy in the cracks between empires. By her teenage years, she wasn't just admired, she was feared not only for her royal blood, but for her refusal to fit the mold of a royal woman. She wasn't a pawn, she was a blade. Sinaine was born in a palace, raised on horseback and baptized in steel. She wasn't meant to survive in a man's world. She was meant to conquer it. To be born royal in Macedon was to be born into a game of strategy. But to be born the half-sister of Alexander the Great, that was a life spent balancing on a dagger's edge. Sinaine and Alexander shared the same father, Philip II, but different mothers. His mother, Olympias, was infamous for her ambition and ruthlessness. Hers, Ordata, was Illyrian royalty, tough as the mountain tribe she hailed from childhood. Sinaine knew she would never be the heir. That title had already been handed to Alexander, the golden boy with the lion's mane and the philosopher's tutor. The court adored him, the generals feared him, and the world one day would kneel before him. But Sinaine didn't kneel. As Alexander grew into the legend we now remember, Sinaine carved a quieter, sharper path. While he rode into Persia, she remained in Macedon. Observing how empires function from within, she saw how alliances shifted like sand dunes, how one wrong word could end a dynasty. She learned the real battlefield wasn't always fought with swords. Sometimes it was fought in whispers. Still, she was no cloistered noblewoman. Sinaine's reputation as a warrior began to circulate. Rumors of her military prowess, her ability to ride, fight, and lead, echoed in the corridors of power. She may not have crossed deserts or stormed cities like Alexander, but she was no less dangerous. She had something he never did: silence. Sinaine didn't need the world to watch her. She needed them to underestimate her. But in a kingdom obsessed with lineage and legitimacy, blood was currency, and Sinaine had plenty of it. She was not only the daughter of Philip, but the sister of the king, and her Illyrian bloodline connected her to another branch of warriors. She could unite kingdoms or break them. She didn't challenge Alexander, not directly. There was no battle between them. But she was a constant reminder that power didn't belong only to men. Her presence, her lineage, and her skill were threats. Quiet ones, but threats nonetheless. And when Alexander marched east to chase immortality, Sinaine stayed behind, watching the gears of empire turn, waiting. Studying, because even the greatest shadow can't cover everything. Not forever. Sinaine wasn't content with being a figure of quiet potential. She made herself a legend through action. While Alexander built his empire abroad, Sinaine found her own battlefield at home, and unlike many royal women of her time, she didn't just lead from behind a curtain. She rode in armor, led troops, and fought on horseback like a Macedonian general. Her most famous moment came when she led a military campaign into Illyria, the very land of her mother. It wasn't just a symbolic march. Sinaine actively commanded troops, organized strategy, and fought in combat in a time when even noblemen often avoided the front lines. A royal woman charging into battle was both shocking and awe-inspiring. And it wasn't just for show. She emerged victorious. That campaign wasn't just a flex of military skill. It was a declaration. Sinaine was staking a claim. She wasn't merely a noblewoman with a sharp mind. She was a trained warrior who had proven herself on the field, bloodied and unbroken. Her Illyrian blood had not thinned in the halls of Macedonian diplomacy. It had sharpened. By winning that campaign, Sinaine did something extraordinary. She carved out a sphere of influence independent of her brother's colossal shadow. Alexander might have ruled eastward, but Sinaine was building something of her own in the west. Respect, loyalty, and a reputation not tied to anyone else's name. But power is never comfortable in the hands of a woman, especially a woman who doesn't ask permission. Back in Macedon, the court murmured to Alexander. Too occupied with conquering Persia and Egypt, did not interfere, but his absence created a fragile vacuum, and Sinaine knew exactly how dangerous that space could become. She wasn't just a warrior for her own sake, she had a plan that reached beyond herself. She was a mother now, and she intended to pass on her power. So while men wrote history in their own image, Sinaine prepared for the next move. She had tasted command, stain her armor in real combat, and won not by birthright, but by merit. She was no mere royal. She was a commander, and she was just getting started. For all her victories and warrior spirit, Senane's most audacious move was not made with a sword, but with a daughter. Her child, Adir, was born of her marriage to Amyntas Forfer, a man who himself had royal blood but little political strength. Their union was strategic, a way for Senane to connect her bloodline deeper into the royal web. But Amyntas was soon dead, likely a victim of Philip II's relentless housecleaning. Senane, however, survived. More than that, she saw opportunity in the ashes. She began raising Adia not as a passive princess, but as a future queen. From the very beginning, Adia was trained with the same fire Senane had received as a girl. This wasn't a child being groomed for a decorative marriage. This was a young woman being sharpened like a blade. Senane personally oversaw her education, rhetoric, leadership, martial training, and most importantly, politics. It wasn't just about legacy. Senane had watched the world unravel in Alexander's absence. The court was divided, the generals restless and succession uncertain. Alexander had no legitimate heir. His empire was vast but fragile. The question of who would rule once he died wasn't just theoretical. It was a ticking bomb. Senane had a plan. Her daughter would marry Aridaeus, Alexander's half-brother, who was considered next in line despite his intellectual disability. If Adia became his wife and Senane her advisor, they would have real influence over the Macedonian throne. This was more than ambition. It was survival. The empire was splintering. Power was being hoarded by generals and regents. Senane saw that only through Adea could she continue to shape the future. She wasn't just trying to put her daughter on the throne. She was trying to protect Macedon from itself. But this was not a world kind to women who made moves like kings. Whispers turned to threats. The regents, particularly Perdiccas, one of Alexander's former generals, saw what was coming. A warrior mother raising a queen with a claim to the throne was too dangerous. Senane, ever bold, prepared to travel with Adia to ensure the marriage happened. She was ready for resistance, but not the betrayal that awaited her on the road. She had trained her daughter for the throne. Now she would pay the price for it. Senane knew exactly what she was doing when she set out for Asia with her daughter. This was not a diplomatic visit. This was a political maneuver, the kind that could change the shape of an empire. Adia, young but regal, was to be married to King Aridaeus. That union would tie Senane's bloodline directly to the throne and give her a front-row seat to the regency of Alexander's fractured empire. But the men in power saw it differently. To Perdiccas, the ambitious general serving as regent, Senane was not a royal matron. She was a threat, a woman with her own army, her own agenda, and worse still, public support. Soldiers admired her. Macedonians respected her. Her daughter had the blood of Philip, the charisma of a queen, and the backing of one of the last true heirs. Perdiccas couldn't risk it. As Senane and Adia crossed into Asia Minor, they were intercepted by forces under Alcidas, Perdiccas' own brother. The moment was tense. The outcome was chillingly swift. Senane, unarmed but unshaken, stood her ground. Some sources say she demanded to see the king. Others suggest she attempted to rally the soldiers against the regents right there on the spot. But it was too late. The order had already been given. Senane was assassinated, likely by Alcidas himself or under his command on the road, far from court, far from justice. She died not in battle, but by betrayal, stabbed not for her crimes, but for her ambition. What happened next shocked, even hardened Macedonian veterans. The very soldiers who witnessed her murder reportedly rebelled. Senane, after all, was the daughter of Philip II, a war hero in her own right. Killing a woman of her stature wasn't just a crime, it was sacrilege. So intense was the backlash that Perdiccas was forced to backtrack. In a stunning reversal, he allowed Adia to marry Aridaeus after all. But the cost had been steep. Macedon had lost one of its most capable minds and most dangerous women, not to enemies, but to its own fears. Senane died with her armor off, but her strategy lived on. Her daughter was now queen. The next move was no longer hers, but it would still bear her name. Sinane's death was supposed to end the threat, but instead it lit a fire. Her daughter, now married to King Aridaeus, entered the political arena with the fury of a legacy interrupted, and she did not remain a deer for long. In a powerful move, she changed her name to Eurydice, a name echoing queens of the Argead dynasty. It wasn't just a rebranding, it was a declaration of legitimacy. Queen Eurydice now stood beside the king of Macedon. Not a puppet, not a consort, but a partner in rule. Though Aridaeus was mentally impaired and heavily controlled by regents like Perdiccas and later Antipater, Eurydice quickly became the active voice of the throne. She took an unprecedented step for a woman in Macedonian politics. She began addressing the army directly, wearing military attire and asserting her right to govern on behalf of her husband and herself. These weren't symbolic gestures. Eurydice stepped into the vacuum her mother left with military poise and political instinct. She held speeches in front of soldiers, grizzled veterans who had followed Alexander across the known world, and she won them over. She promised order, Macedonian strength, and a return to rigid leadership. Her mere presence reminded them of Sinane, and the army listened. But her rise came at a dangerous moment, the Wars of the Diadochi. The bloody civil wars between Alexander's former generals were already underway. Macedon was fragmenting, alliances cracked, loyalties shifted like sand. Eurydice stood in the middle of it, a young queen with no army of her own, challenging men who commanded legions. Still, she played boldly. She stood up to Polyperchon, the newly appointed regent, and tried to maintain control of the capital. She refused to back down, writing letters, issuing orders, and rallying troops. For a time, she seemed unstoppable. But like her mother, Eurydice's power came not just from her bloodline, but from the threat she posed to men in power. She was Sinane's daughter through and through, armored in pride, fluent in strategy, and unafraid to confront the ruling elite. Her story, like her mother's, would be defined not by submission, but by defiance, and though she now wore the crown her mother had fought for, the enemies gathering around her would not tolerate a queen who ruled like a king. Eurydice's rise to power was swift, but so was the storm that followed. The Macedonian Empire, already fracturing under the weight of Alexander's absence, had become a battlefield of old generals, all clawing for control. At the heart of this chaos was Polyperchon, the aging general newly appointed as regent. To him, Eurydice was an anomaly, young, ambitious, and worst of all, politically effective. She had the troops, she had the bloodline, and she had the fire of Sinane running in her veins. At first, Eurydice tried diplomacy. She challenged Polyperchon in writing, issuing royal decrees in her own name. She appeared in military dress before the army, calling out his authority. These were not empty gestures. For a moment, the balance of power seemed to teeter in her favor. Many in the army remembered her mother, and some were willing to follow her. But Polyperchon wasn't alone. He had a powerful ally, Olympias, the mother of Alexander the Great. After years in exile, Olympias returned to Macedon with vengeance in her heart and murder in her strategy. The rivalry between the two women, Eurydice and Olympias, it was more than personal. It was the final brutal clash of two dynastic visions. Eurydice stood for a new order, young, militaristic, and independent. Olympias represented the old Argead fire, the bloodline that had once ruled unchallenged. Eurydice marched to confront her enemies, but was betrayed. Her troops, faced with the revered Olympias and her more experienced forces, abandoned her. She and King Aridaeus were captured. The crown, once so close, was ripped from her head. What came next was not politics, it was revenge. Olympias had Eurydice imprisoned and forced her to commit suicide. The daughter of Sinane, like her mother, died not in battle, but because she dared to claim power in a man's world. Her husband was murdered soon after. Their deaths weren't just executions, they were warnings etched in blood, sent to every woman who might think of leading armies or wearing crowns. But even in death, Eurydice left a mark. Her story became legend, whispered among soldiers and remembered by historians as a flash of defiance in a darkening world. She had inherited her mother's soul and shared her fate. Sinane and Eurydice are rarely mentioned in the same breath as Alexander, Philip, or Olympias. Their names linger on the margins of history, footnotes in an empire obsessed with male conquest. Yet their lives, full of courage, strategy, and resistance, carved a path through the brutal politics of their time. They were more than noble women. They were a dynasty of defiance. Sinaine had been a daughter of Philip, trained not to marry well, but to fight well. She had stepped onto a battlefield when most royal women were stepping into marriage contracts. She had outlived her husband, outmaneuvered her enemies, and trained her daughter for power in a world that had no room for powerful women. In an age where even queens had little agency, Sinaine led troops into combat and not for ceremonial show. She fought to win. Her daughter inherited that fire, and when Sinaine died by assassination, Eurydice took the torch and carried it to the throne. She may have ruled briefly, but her impact was unforgettable in front of assembled soldiers. Eurydice stood in full military dress and addressed them as commander. She wasn't a pawn. She wasn't waiting to be chosen. She chose herself, and that's what made them dangerous. The men who killed them weren't only defending political control. They were defending a system, a world where women could inspire loyalty but not lead armies, could bear heirs but not rule empires. Sinaine and Eurydice proved that women didn't need permission to claim power. They only needed opportunity. What's extraordinary is how close they came to succeeding. In another timeline, one less afraid of their strength, Sinaine might have led campaigns alongside Alexander. Eurydice might have stabilized the throne, restoring Macedonian pride after Alexander's empire collapsed. Instead, both were killed, not for failure, but for being too effective. Their legacies survive in fragments. Roman historians mention them in passing. A few ancient coins hint at Eurydice's brief reign, but the full weight of their stories has been buried under centuries of male-focused glory. Still, the outline remains a mother who trained like a soldier and a daughter who ruled like a king. They were born into conquest, and in their own fierce, tragic way. They left a conquest of their own. Sinaine and Eurydice were silenced, but their stories never truly vanished. They linger like distant thunder in the chronicles of the empire, like blood on a blade that history tried to polish. For centuries, they were overshadowed by their male relatives, by Alexander's brilliant campaigns, by Philip's reforms, by Olympia's deadly cunning. But if you look closely, you can trace their presence like footprints through wet earth. Sinaine, who led soldiers into Illyria and returned victorious. Eurydice, who donned armor and defied generals face to face. Neither ruled long, neither died peacefully. But their courage left a blueprint for resistance, for female power, for what a woman could be in an empire designed to crush her. Their erasure is part of a pattern. Ancient historians, mostly men, recorded events through the lens of power and prestige. Women like Sinaine weren't celebrated. They were feared, minimized, or written off as ambitious beyond their station. But the fragments survive in brief lines, in bitter deaths, in the outrage of armies who witnessed their assassinations and recoiled at the injustice. And in those fragments, something remarkable remains: willpower. Neither woman needed a crown to claim authority. They embodied it through action, leadership, and sheer presence. Their power wasn't inherited, but forged from training fields, battle scars, and public defiance. Sinaine's very existence challenged the idea that only men could shape the world. Eurydice proved a woman could wear royal regalia and speak to warriors without trembling, even today. Their names raise questions. What might have changed had they lived longer? Could Macedon have held together under Eurydice's rule? Could Sinaine have been the war leader Macedon needed after Alexander's death? We'll never know, but the possibility itself is a legacy. Modern scholars are beginning to rediscover them, pulling their stories from the dust of forgotten scrolls, not as side characters, but as protagonists of their own brutal, brilliant narratives. Sinaine and Eurydice didn't survive their world, but they disrupted it. And for that they echo not as ghosts of empire, but as reminders of what power looks like when it refuses to beg for permission. Their crowns were stolen, their stories almost erased, but their fire still burns, even if history tried to bury the ashes. Before there were belts, masters, or cinematic legends, martial arts began in the silence between survival and the sacred. Across early civilizations, the act of fighting wasn't just practical, it was ritualistic. It was how communities trained their bodies, protected their borders, and shaped their spirits. The earliest martial arts didn't emerge from sport. They grew out of necessity long before writing. People were already grappling, striking, and weapon training. But over time, simple survival turned into something deeper. Combat became a discipline, a code, a path toward mastery, not just of the body, but of the self. Take ancient hunters, for example. Their movements, lunges, thrusts, evasions became the foundation of martial patterns. Each hunt was a rehearsal for war, and every war demanded a stronger, smarter, more synchronized warriors. But when weapons were laid down, the movements remained. They were practiced again and again until they became ritual, a kind of physical language that could be passed down across generations. Across the world, this pattern repeated in the Indus Valley. Carved seals from over 4,000 years ago show figures and stances eerily similar to those in modern martial arts in Africa. Tribal wrestling formed the basis of coming-of-age ceremonies. In Mesopotamia and Egypt, soldiers trained in organized formations but also honed personal combat styles, ones involving hand-to-hand strikes and grappling holds. Their physicality was a kind of literacy. To fight was to speak the language of kings, and always combat was paired with symbolism. Movements mimicked animals, spirits, or cosmic forces. A strike wasn't just a blow. It was the embodiment of a myth. A sequence of motions could mirror a battle between gods or serve as a prayer for protection. Martial practice became ceremonial, integrated into festivals, funerals, and religious rites. Even in death, warriors were honored for their form. Ancient tombs contain weapons carefully placed beside skeletons, not as tools, but as symbols of identity. The sword wasn't just something you carried, it was who you were. So in these ancient worlds, martial arts weren't side activities. They were essential rites, a merging of the physical, the mental, and the divine. It wasn't about fighting, it was about becoming. In the misty, palm-covered hills of southern India lies the ancient birthplace of what many believe to be the world's oldest martial art, Kalaripayattu. Born in the region of Kerala, this system dates back over 3,000 years and possibly more, emerging from a civilization where combat, medicine, and spiritual practice were deeply intertwined. The word Kalari refers to a training ground, and Payattu means to fight or practice. But Kalaripayattu was never just about fighting. It was a discipline of transformation, a system where warriors trained not only to defeat enemies, but to master themselves. It combined strikes, grapples, and weapon techniques with deep breath control, meditation, and stretches that predate modern yoga. According to tradition, the art was shaped by the sage Parashurama, a divine warrior believed to have reclaimed the land of Kerala from the sea. He created Kalaripayattu not merely as a combat system, but as a sacred path to balance power with wisdom. Students began training at a young age, learning body control, flexibility, and agility before ever touching a weapon. The training grounds, or Kalaris, were considered sacred spaces. Entering the Kalari was a ritual. Students bowed to the earth, the gods, and their master. Lessons began with Mepiyatu, the body conditioning sequences. These were fluid, almost dance-like routines meant to awaken every muscle, tendon, and joint. The movements drew from nature, the strikes of the snake, the grace of the peacock, the ferocity of the lion. Weapons came later, wooden sticks, curved swords, daggers, spears, and the legendary Yarumi, a flexible whip-like blade so dangerous it required total body mastery to wield safely. But alongside combat, students also learned Ayurvedic medicine, how to heal what they had the power to hurt. And there was always philosophy. Kalaripayattu taught humility, patience, and respect for life. Victory without control was failure. Power without compassion was chaos. When foreign invaders arrived, first the Portuguese, later the British, Kalaripayattu was suppressed. But it never died. It went underground, passed on in whispers and footwork, hidden in dance and disguised as healing. Today, it still survives, not just as a martial art, but as a living link to one of humanity's earliest visions of what it means to be both a warrior and a sage. To most of the world, the phrase martial arts brings to mind one word, kung fu. But in China, kung fu gong fu doesn't just mean fighting. It means mastery earned through effort, whether in calligraphy, cooking, or combat. And nowhere is that spirit more fully embodied than in the ancient martial traditions rooted in the temples, mountains, and battlefields of early China. The origins of Chinese martial arts stretch back over 4,000 years. Ancient military texts from the Zhou dynasty describe hand-to-hand combat drills, weapon techniques, and battlefield formations. But the true heart of Kung Fu emerged, where philosophy met motion in the silence of the monasteries. The most famous origin story begins in the Shaolin Temple, a Buddhist sanctuary nestled in the Song Mountains. Legend says that in the 5th century CE, a monk named Bodhidharma, who traveled from India, introduced meditative practices that would evolve into Shaolin Kung Fu. He noticed that the monks, weakened from long hours of seated meditation, needed physical conditioning to balance the spirit. So he taught them forms, fluid movements that mimicked animals, synchronized breath, and sharpened awareness. Over centuries, these forms became complex martial systems, each with its own rhythm, philosophy, and purpose. Tiger style for strength, crane for grace, snake for fluidity. Every motion was a metaphor for a principle. Attack with speed, defend with emptiness, strike within a stillness. Shaolin monks weren't just fighters. They were spiritual athletes. They believed that to master combat, you must first conquer the self. This wasn't about brute strength. It was about internal power. The idea of chi life energy was central. Movements weren't random. They were vessels for circulating chi, balancing yin and yang, aligning the body with the cosmos. Kung Fu also branched beyond Shaolin. Taoist monks in the Wudong Mountains developed their own soft, flowing styles like Tai Chi, which emphasized harmony, breath, and the redirection of force. These styles prioritized energy control over impact, showing that martial power could come from yielding, not clashing. Throughout dynastic wars, cultural revolutions, and modernization, Kung Fu endured, not just as combat training, but as a living philosophy. It taught ethics, restraint, and discipline, to fight without anger, to win without arrogance. Because in China, the true enemy was never just an opponent. It was in balance with it. In the dust of ancient Greek arenas, under the blazing sun of Olympia, there's a martial art so raw and so complete, it made even seasoned hoplites flinch. It was called pankration, a word that means all powers or total strength. And it wasn't just a sport. It was warfare, stripped of weapons and placed at the feet of the gods. Pankration first entered the Olympic Games in 648 BCE, and almost immediately it became legendary. A blend of wrestling and striking, this was full contact combat at its most primal. Competitors punched, kicked, grappled, choked, and broke bones. The only two rules: no biting, no eye gouging. Everything else was fair game. But pankration wasn't chaos. It was discipline. Fighters trained in strategy and control, not wild brutality. They studied the mechanics of the human body, where to strike, how to pivot, when to lock a joint or crush the windpipe. They trained relentlessly in the palestra, where gymnastic conditioning met hand-to-hand tactics. Pancratiasts were admired not just for strength, but for technique and mental toughness, and the art wasn't confined to the games. Greek soldiers practiced pankration for the battlefield. It was part of the warrior's toolkit. If your spear broke, your shield splintered, and your sword fell, you fought with pankration, close quarters, barehanded and unforgiving. Legendary tales grew around its champions. One speaks of Arishan of Phegalia, who died during a match after locking his opponent in a final submission hold. Though lifeless, his opponent conceded defeat, and Arishan was crowned victor posthumously. He became the embodiment of what pankration represented: absolute commitment, even unto death. Yet like many ancient martial systems, pankration faded with time. When Rome absorbed Greece, gladiatorial spectacle overtook it later. With the fall of the pagan world and the rise of new cultural orders, its practice all but vanished. But its legacy lived on in the philosophy of using the whole body as a weapon, in the balance of aggression and control, and in the roots it planted in modern combat sports like MMA. Today, historians and martial artists alike view pankration as one of the most complete fighting systems of the ancient world because of the Greeks. True strength wasn't just about violence. It was about mastering every part of yourself in the moment when everything else was lost. When we think of ancient Egypt, we think of pyramids, pharaohs, and gods with animal heads. But beneath the golden mask of Tutankhamun and the shadow of the Sphinx was a militarized civilization where martial skill wasn't just a soldier's tool. It was a path to honor and status. Egypt's earliest records of martial arts appear not in text, but in art. On the walls of tombs in Beni Hassan, dating back to around 2000 BCE, there are over 400 depictions of grappling techniques, throws, locks, and stances. These images, striking in detail, show that Egyptian warriors trained in unarmed combat with surprising sophistication. Wrestling was not a pastime, it was a national passion. Young nobles trained in martial disciplines from an early age. Combat was seen as both physical excellence and spiritual preparation. The soldier wasn't just a fighter, he was a protector of Ma'at, the divine balance of the world. To train the body was to prepare to defend that cosmic order. But Egypt's martial tradition extended far beyond wrestling. Warriors were schooled in stick fighting. Known today in its modern descendant as Tatib, this elegant yet fierce art involved rhythmic movements with a long staff, often performed to drums. Though it evolved into a ceremonial dance over the centuries, its roots were deeply martial, used by guards, soldiers, and royal bodyguards. Weapons training included archery, spears, daggers, and battle axes. But close-quarters combat was no less important. Egyptian warriors had to be versatile. In chariot warfare, for instance, soldiers were trained to shoot with deadly precision while racing at full speed, an ancient form of mobile martial art that demanded nerves of steel and unbreakable focus. Even in myth, martial prowess mattered. Gods like Horus, the falcon-headed protector, were warriors first. Locked in eternal combat with chaos, pharaohs modeled themselves on these divine fighters, presenting their victories as reflections of divine will. War was sacred, and those who fought it were not just men, they were instruments of order. Though Egypt's martial systems never survived in a formal lineage like Shaolin Kung Fu or Kalarippayattu, their spirit remains etched in stone, in rhythm, and in ritual. Because along the Nile, to fight was not just to conquer, it was to preserve the universe itself. Long before the word samurai echoed through scrolls and songs, Japan's martial identity was already forming in the misty valleys and storm-swept shores of its islands. The origins of Japanese martial arts lie not in modern karate dojos or sword fighting duels, but in ancient ritual, clan warfare, and spiritual discipline. In the earliest centuries, during the Yayoi and Kofun periods, warriors fought with bronze weapons, stone-tipped arrows, and raw practical techniques designed for survival. These early forms lacked structure but emphasized efficiency, group cohesion, and instinctual movement. Fighting wasn't just physical, it was deeply tribal. Loyalty to clan and family was everything. To fight well was to protect your bloodline. But as Japan entered the Heian period, 794-1185 CE, martial culture began to crystallize. Mounted archery became central. The ideal warrior wasn't just a brute with a sword, he was a horseman, archer, and scholar. This period gave rise to the bushi, the early prototype of the samurai, whose code blended battlefield skill with personal honor. The foundation of many Japanese martial arts developed from this evolving warrior class. One of the earliest systems was Kyujitsu, the art of the bow. Archers trained to shoot from horseback using the yumi, a tall asymmetrical bow requiring extraordinary strength and control. Over time, this evolved into Kudo, the way of the bow, which emphasized not just aim, but spiritual focus, breath, and mindfulness. Kenjutsu, or sword technique, also began to emerge. Though swords were not yet the dominant weapon, techniques were battlefield-tested, direct, and often brutal, far from the polished forms we associate with modern katana duels. Swords were tools, not symbols. Yet within the folds of these techniques, a code of conduct was growing. By the time of the Kamakura period, this code evolved into what we now know as Bushido, the way of the warrior, honor, and loyalty. Self-discipline and inner peace became as vital as victory. Martial training became not just preparation for war, but a moral path. Swordsmanship, archery, and later hand-to-hand combat systems like jiu-jitsu were practiced as both physical arts and spiritual exercises. In early Japan, to fight was to follow a path of balance between life and death, technique and heart, body and soul. And the warrior wasn't just expected to win, he was expected to die well. When we talk about the origins of martial arts, Africa is too often left out of the conversation. But across this vast and diverse continent, ancient cultures developed powerful, sophisticated, and deeply rooted martial traditions, systems shaped by survival, spirituality, and ceremony. These weren't just methods of combat, they were expressions of identity, heritage, and sacred duty. One of the most enduring African martial practices is Dam, the ancient combat sport of the Hausa people in West Africa. Traditionally performed by butchers and members of warrior guilds, Dam combines bare-knuckle boxing with powerful low kicks. Fighters wrap one hand, called a spear, in cloth or hardened rope, while the other remains open for defense. Matches often take place during harvest festivals and public gatherings, turning combat into celebration. But make no mistake, this is warrior training preserved through ritual. In Senegal, another ancient tradition thrives: Layam, or Senegalese wrestling. More than a sport, Layam is a national art form, its roots reaching back to pre-Islamic times when it served as a rite of passage for young men. Wrestlers engage in powerful grappling, accompanied by drums, dance, and spiritual chants. Before combat, fighters often consult marabouts, spiritual leaders, who offer charms and blessings. Strength alone won't guarantee victory. One must also have spiritual favor. Farther south in Zulu culture, the martial legacy of Nguni stick fighting tells a different story. Practiced by young Zulu boys as part of initiation and military training, this art involves a striking stick and a blocking stick used in lightning-fast exchanges. Beyond preparing boys for future combat, stick fighting also built courage, reflexes, and a warrior's mindset. Even the legendary Shaka Zulu was said to have refined battle techniques by observing and modifying traditional stick fighting strategies into formations that reshaped southern African warfare in Ethiopia. Historical paintings and manuscripts depict soldiers using spears, shields, and short swords in tightly organized formations, sometimes accompanied by wrestling traditions that emphasize throws and body control, skills necessary in both battle and ritual. In African martial arts, the line between fight and festival, battle and belief was always thin. Movement was meaning, combat was culture, and across the continent the warrior was more than a fighter. He was a protector, a performer, and a living vessel of his people's spirit. Long before European ships touched the shores of the Americas, the indigenous peoples of continents had already developed rich and complex martial traditions. These systems weren't organized into schools or written down in manuals, but they were real, practiced, and deeply embedded in culture, ceremony, and survival among the Aztecs. Martial culture was central to civilization. From an early age, boys were sent to Telpak Kali, or youth training houses, where they learned warfare, discipline, and weapons handling. The Makuahuitl, a wooden sword embedded with obsidian blades, was a symbol of elite warriors. It could slice through flesh with terrifying ease. But Aztec martial arts were more than technique. They were tied to religion. Warfare was a sacred duty, a way to capture prisoners for ritual sacrifice, and a path to honor in the afterlife. Aztec warriors were organized into elite orders, such as the Eagle and Jaguar warriors, whose names weren't just titles, they were spiritual identities. Combat was a way to embody the spirit of the animal, to transform oneself into a living weapon guided by divine purpose. The Inca Empire had its own formidable martial culture. While the Inca are better known for engineering and empire building, they trained soldiers extensively. Their warriors used slings, spears, bolas, and clubs with strategic precision and trained in formations suited to mountain warfare. Young warriors were taught strength, endurance, and loyalty to the state. Warfare was not just political, it was ritualized, a test of cosmic balance. In the North American regions, many indigenous tribes practiced warrior rites tied closely to spiritual life. The Lakota, Apache, and Comanche, for example, had deep warrior traditions involving stealth, ambush tactics, horsemanship, and close-quarters combat. Skills were honed through hunting, scouting, and inter-tribal conflict. But what mattered as much as bravery was humility. The ideal warrior was disciplined, honorable, and bound to the welfare of the tribe. Combat training was often expressed through games and dances, ritualized forms of preparation that built strength, reflexes, and unity. The war dance wasn't just theater. It was a moving invocation, blending spirit with strike, rhythm with readiness. Across the Americas, martial arts weren't isolated techniques. They were extensions of worldviews. To fight was to serve not just the tribe, but the land, the ancestors, and the balance of all things. What began as survival, how to hunt, how to defend, how to kill, became something far deeper. Across the ancient world, martial arts evolved into spiritual disciplines, tools for shaping not just warriors, but entire cultures from India to China, from Africa to the Americas. Every civilization developed its own system of combat. But what unites them isn't just the strikes, holds, or weapons. It's how those movements became ritual. Training grounds turned into sacred spaces. Warriors became symbols of cosmic order. Combat itself became a path not to destruction, but to self-mastery. These early martial arts didn't teach violence for its own sake. They taught control, humility, and balance. In Kalaripayattu, the fighter is also a healer. In Kung Fu, the battle is internal as much as external. In Pancration, the test is mental endurance as much as physical skill. Even in the tribal dances of Africa and the war games of the Americas, the lesson is the same. True strength lies not in dominance, but in discipline. Over time, many of these traditions were suppressed, scattered, or transformed by conquest, colonization, and modernization. The British banned Kalaripayattu. Chinese martial arts were driven underground during political upheavals. African systems were masked in ritual to survive. Native American combat knowledge was pushed aside by force, and yet none of it truly disappeared. Fragments survived in folk dance, oral storytelling, and community rituals. Others resurfaced in modern martial arts, reborn in karate, judo, capoeira, MMA, and more. The roots are ancient, even if the forms are new. Today, when someone steps onto a mat, bows before a teacher, or learns a new technique, they're not just learning how to fight. They're participating in a lineage that stretches back thousands of years, where motion is memory and every movement is a whisper from the past. The ancient masters may be gone, their battles long finished, but their philosophies endure. They taught that martial arts are not about defeating others. They're about defeating yourself again and again, until ego, fear, and rage fall away. What remains is stillness, precision, purpose. Because in the end, every martial art, no matter its origin, tells the same story. The journey of a human being learning how to be strong, not just with the fist, but with the spirit. Cleanliness is next to godliness, said absolutely no one in the 14th century. Let's begin with a surprising fact. In the early Middle Ages, bathing was actually considered a good thing. Monasteries had bathhouses. Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing still lingered in some corners of Europe. But over time, particularly by the late medieval period, the idea of bathing shifted from healthy to hazardous. So what changed? In short, fear, superstition, and a wildly incorrect understanding of how the human body worked. People believed that hot water opened pores, which they thought allowed illness to seep in. Imagine bathing during a plague outbreak and thinking I've just turned myself into a sponge for death. That was the mindset. Bathing too often, they feared, could weaken your body and even invite disease. Water in this worldview wasn't cleansing. It was treacherous. It didn't help that bathhouses became morally suspicious. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many public bathhouses, once places of hygiene and even community, became social hubs with a rather scandalous reputation. Some operated like spas, others like brothels. Eventually, church leaders began to associate bathing with sin, which in medieval Europe was an excellent way to get things shut down. So instead of scrubbing down, many medieval folks just stopped bathing altogether. Not because they loved being dirty, but because staying dry was seen as safer, holier, and frankly, more modest. After all, being naked was one thing. Being naked in hot water, that was practically inviting the devil in for a splash. This doesn't mean everyone wandered around like a mud-covered goblin. People still cleaned themselves in bits and pieces, washing hands, faces, and feet with cloths and herbal rinses. But the full-body soak became rare, reserved for the very wealthy, the dangerously brave, or the terminally itchy. So yes, medieval people feared bathing, but not because they were lazy or ignorant. They were trying in their own 14th century way to stay healthy. Unfortunately, without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or a basic grasp of microbiology, the strategy was more paranoia than prevention. Once upon a time, in a town that didn't yet smell like horse manure and regret, The public bathhouse was a hub of hygiene, health, and mildly inappropriate social interaction. Inspired by lingering Roman influence, early medieval bathhouses offered warm water, communal tubs, and a hint of optimism. These were places where townsfolk could soak, steam, and chat like a medieval spa day, minus the cucumbers and scented candles. Monks, merchants, and even lower nobles used them. Cleanliness for a brief moment in time was both possible and fashionable. Then things got steamy in the worst way. By the 13th century, bathhouses had acquired a reputation for, let's say, multitasking. Bathing became less about cleanliness and more about companionship. Some bathhouses began offering extra services with attendants who were suspiciously friendly and water that had seen far too many strangers. The line between wellness and wantonness blurred fast. It didn't take long for the church to get involved. Public nudity, even when paired with a loofah, was frowned upon. Sexual misconduct, even worse. Bathhouses became synonymous with sin, disease, and scandal. And once the Black Death rolled into town, people were more than happy to shut them down permanently after all. You can't spread plague through a public tub if the tub's been boarded shut and declared morally compromised. But it wasn't just sin and sickness that doomed the bathhouse. It was suspicious. Over time, bathing itself began to seem indulgent, even dangerous. The very idea of soaking your body in warm water, especially with strangers, felt like a gateway to both physical and spiritual ruin. And so one by one, the bathhouses closed. Some were turned into bakeries. Others were simply abandoned and left to rot. A poetic fate, really, for buildings meant to keep people clean. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks quietly lamented the loss. Many had maintained hygienic practices for centuries, including scheduled bathing, but now even that was in question. The church wasn't banning hygiene outright, just making it incredibly difficult to achieve. Thus began the golden age of dry cleaning, medieval style. Soap became optional, water became suspicious. And the bathhouse? Just another relic of a time when scrubbing didn't come with consequences, despite the church's growing horror at naked elbows and the widespread belief that a hot bath could let the plague in through your pores. Medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of bathing. They just turned it into something you do once a season, or when the smell became sentient. Let's begin with the nobles. Yes, wealthy people bathed, though not so often that their rubber ducks got wrinkly. They had servants lugging cauldrons of boiling water, because indoor plumbing was still centuries away, pour it into a large wooden tub lined with a linen sheet, and sprinkle it with herbs like lavender, sage, or whatever was growing nearby that didn't smell like feet. This wasn't so much a bath as it was a soup you sat in. The bath was often prepared in the bedroom or near a fireplace. Privacy optional, depending on your level of power or shamelessness. Some even shared the tub with their spouse, because what's more romantic than floating in each other's filth like medieval fondue? The poor bathed too, but usually in rivers, barrels, or anything that held water and didn't bite. It wasn't about hygiene, it was about efficiency. Might as well wash the kid, the shirt, and the goat all at once was probably said more than once. In winter, bathing took a backseat to survival, so instead of soap and water, people turned to a strategy known as pretend you're clean and just keep walking. A few urban bathhouses survived, particularly in southern Europe, where warmer weather and better plumbing kept the dream of cleanliness alive. These were sometimes well run with steam rooms and herbal treatments. Other times they doubled as venues for extracurricular activities not approved by the Vatican. Either way, you left refreshed, mildly steamed, and possibly slightly judged. For special occasions like childbirth or plague recovery, people would get proper baths. Because nothing says welcome to the world or please don't die like being dipped in a barrel of tepid rosemary water. When full-body immersion became suspect, thanks to the belief that hot water invited disease like an open bar, the medieval world turned to the next best thing, a humble sponge bath. Except they didn't really have sponges, at least not the soft, mass-produced kind you can buy at any modern store. Instead, they used linen cloth, soaked in warm water, herbs or vinegar, and wiped themselves down like they were trying to buff a stain off a very delicate chair. Hygiene in this context meant dabbing. If you were lucky, someone else did it for you. If you were noble, someone else did it reluctantly. These partial washes focused on hands, face, armpits, and occasionally the feet, the high traffic areas, so to speak, under layers of clothing. Particularly linen shirts and shifts helped absorb sweat and grime, meaning that changing your shirt regularly was about as close to modern hygiene as you were going to get. Your tunic may have been crusty, but your undershirt freshish. Of course, nobody was fooling themselves into thinking this was proper cleaning. But if water was limited, or if you believed a proper bath might invite the Black Death, this was the safe bet. And in a world without deodorant, toothpaste, or showers, a cloth soaked in rosewater or vinegar was the medieval equivalent of a spa day, minus the spa, and really minus the day. For wealthier folks, attendants might heat water, mix in herbs like rosemary or marjoram, and gently wash their master or mistress while pretending not to judge them. Peasants would boil water over a fire, then ladle it out into bowls and do the same, perhaps without the subtle judgment, but definitely with more drought. And if you were a monk, you probably had a better routine than most. Many monastic orders required scheduled washing, even if it was more spiritual than sanitary. Either way, the result was the same. A quick rub down, a whisper of moisture, and a renewed sense of being just clean enough to not scare the livestock. So no, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked more or less. At least until you had to ride a horse for 6 hours through mud. If medieval hair had a motto, it would probably be flammable but fragrant. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't walk around with matted bird nests on their heads. At least not intentionally. They did, in fact, wash their hair. Just not frequently, and certainly not with anything resembling shampoo. So what did they use? A variety of home-brewed concoctions that sounded like the first draft of a spell book. One popular choice was lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, which was great for cutting through grease and also your scalp if used too often. Pair that with water of dubious quality, and you've got yourself a medieval chemical peel. For those hoping to preserve their follicles a little longer, egg yolks were sometimes used as a gentler cleanser. And yes, that meant sitting in a freezing hut with raw eggs sliding down your neck while trying to convince yourself this was nourishing. Others rinsed with beer, which, if nothing else, made you smell like you'd had a wild night, even if you were just trying to remove lice. Some hair washing recipes included vinegar infusions with rosemary or lavender, which did double duty. They covered up other smells and gave the illusion of care. But let's be clear, no one was lathering up and rinsing twice. This was more of a targeted splash and squeeze operation. Water temperature also mattered. Hot water was believed to weaken the brain. Cold water could give you the plague. Lukewarm was the sweet spot, assuming you had fuel to heat it and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a bucket of bath water that your sibling had already used. Brushing, on the other hand, was routine. Combs made of bone, wood or horn were common and often elaborately carved. A rare moment of elegance in an otherwise itchy reality, and people took pride in long, well-kept hair. Noble women in particular might spend hours getting their hair braided, coiled, and veiled, all while hoping a nearby fireplace didn't undo their hard work with one rogue spark. Dental care in medieval Europe was less sparkling and more. I still have most of my teeth. What's your excuse? Now, to their credit, medieval people didn't entirely ignore oral hygiene. They didn't exactly understand it either, but they made a solid effort using what they had, which was mostly cloth, charcoal, and blind hope. There were no toothbrushes. That innovation was still centuries away. Instead, people used linen rags to rub their teeth clean, ideally soaked in something abrasive like salt, crushed mint, or even burnt rosemary ash. The goal wasn't a whitewash. It was survival. If your breath didn't knock someone over, you were already winning. Some opted for chewing sticks, thin twigs from trees like hazel or elm, frayed at one end to create a brush-like effect. You'd chew until the fibers separated, then scrub your teeth. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush, organic, compostable, and weirdly bark-flavored. To freshen breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom. Depending on what they could afford or steal from the spice rack in wealthier circles, you might rinse your mouth with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water, because nothing says dental sophistication like gargling a fluid also used to embalm pharaohs. And if you're wondering about toothpaste, it did sort of exist. Some recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash, mixed with honey or oil to form a gritty paste. If your mouth didn't feel cleaner afterward, it at least felt sandblasted. Now, dentists, if you could call them that, were usually barbers on their off days. If a tooth was loose, infected, or just annoying, the solution was simple. Yank it out. No anesthetic, no questions. Just a wooden chair, a strong grip, and a few words to God. Aftercare included rinsing with wine and hoping your soul left your body before the infection set in. Despite all this, medieval people weren't necessarily toothless. Diets were lower in processed sugar, and many rural folks had better dental health than modern snackers. But when rot did set in, it set in fast, and the only toothpaste strong enough to fix it was divine intervention. Let's be honest. If you time traveled to a bustling medieval town square, your first reaction wouldn't be up. It would be gagging, because medieval Europe smelled committed to being unforgettable. There was no sewage system, no deodorant, and very few functioning bathtubs, which meant the average ST smelled like a combination of sweat, animals, rotting food, and optimism. If your nose survived a trip through the fish market and passed the tanner shop, congratulations. You'd already done better than most tourists. So how did people deal with this olfactory chaos? They got creative. Enter the pomander, a small hollow ball filled with herbs and spices, worn around the neck or tucked into clothing like a medieval Glade plug-in. These were stuffed with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or musk, and often dipped in ambergris. Whale bath, but fancy to make them smell pleasant. Think of it as carrying around your own portable air filter, only it didn't purify anything, just politely overpower the filth. Ladies often wore scented sachets in their bodices, both to mask their own body odor and to ward off the smell of others. Some even braided herbs like rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair. It was equal parts hygiene fashion and spiritual pest control. For those with coins, perfume was imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet extracted from the rear end of a very surprised cat-like animal. Applying it involved dabbing, waving, and pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of boiled turnips and regret. And then there were the environmental smells: open sewers, livestock, candle smoke, and whatever the local butcher had just flung into the street. Cities were often enveloped in a fog of funk, but no one really complained because everyone was in the same nasal nightmare together. It was communal suffering with notes of garlic. The church encouraged spiritual cleanliness, but physical scent was left largely to chance. If you smelled decent, people assumed you were rich or saintly. If you didn't, you were just blending in. If you've ever forgotten to wear deodorant and spent the day nervously checking your armpits like a suspicious criminal, imagine doing that for your entire life. Except no one had deodorant, and everyone smelled like they'd been jousting in wool for 3 days straight. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where body odor wasn't just a possibility. It was an identity. There were no roll-ons, no sprays, and certainly no clinical-strength aluminum-based antiperspirants. People simply sweated and then made peace with it. Sort of. To mask or manage the musk, people employed various tricks. One common method was alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt that has mild antibacterial and astringent properties. It didn't stop sweat, but it could cut down on the stench, assuming you remembered to apply it and didn't mind grinding rocks into your pits. Others used chalk. Vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular, not because they were effective, but because they smelled like something better than you. The logic was simple. If you can't stop the sweat, at least try to smell like a salad. In fact, perfumed handkerchiefs were all the rage among nobles, mostly so they could hold them under their noses while navigating crowded streets. No one wants to smell like medieval stew meat, but everyone did. The best you could do was smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medicine also played its part, unfortunately. Physicians believed sweating was a healthy way to purge bad humors, so blocking it was seen as suspicious, possibly even dangerous. You were expected to sweat, stink, and let the body cleanse itself. You weren't unclean, you were just medically fragrant. Then there was the fashion problem. Layers upon layers of wool, Linen and fur trapped heat and moisture like a mobile greenhouse. Combine that with open fires, feasting, and the occasional plague, and you had yourself a sensory experience worthy of a full-blown evacuation. But hey, you weren't alone. Everyone around you smelled. Even the king, even the priests, even the woman selling your radishes who hasn't bathed since Epiphany. In short, deodorant wasn't real, but shared suffering absolutely was. In a world without showers, soaps that didn't maim, or deodorant that didn't involve herbs stuffed into your armpit, medieval people turned to an unlikely hero in their hygiene routine. Linen. Not to eat off of, but to wear, preferably close to the body, and change before it grew legs. Linen undergarments were the unsung saviors of the Middle Ages. Breathable, absorbent, and surprisingly durable, they were worn beneath the heavier, more unwashable layers of wool and fur. Linen shirts, chemises, and shifts soaked up the sweat, grime, and everything else the body enthusiastically produced in a world that celebrated moisture but misunderstood soap. The logic was elegant. Wash the linen, not the person, because scrubbing your own body was risky. See the plague. But scrubbing your shirt is perfectly safe. People might go weeks without bathing, but they would change their underlayer, sometimes even twice a week, which by medieval standards was practically saintly. Linen was so respected that it became a status signal. If your shirt was white and relatively clean, people assumed you had your life together. If it was gray, crusty, and sprouting mold, well, you were either poor, possessed, or recently resurrected. For women, the linen shift was essential. It protected outer garments from sweat, and perhaps more importantly, from the smell of sweat. It was the medieval version of Febreze, only less chemical and far more judgmental if not maintained. Knights wore linen under their armor to avoid turning into baked ham during tournaments. Monks wore it under their habits. Even peasants wore linen tunics, though usually patched, threadbare, and held together by sheer willpower. Of course, washing linen wasn't fun. It involved boiling water, beating the fabric on rocks, and hoping the river didn't sweep it away. But it was still easier than bathing yourself or dealing with the spiritual consequences of baring your chest to a tub of warm water. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. Not because people were allergic to linen or hay, though let's be honest, probably that too, but because they were constantly playing host to an entire traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were such an everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted roommates. You didn't get lice. You just had lice. Everyone did. Rich, poor, pious, drunk. Lice didn't discriminate. They were the true equalizers of medieval society. So what did people do? Well, for starters, they combed. Lice combs, often made of bone or wood, were common personal items, like a toothbrush is today, except instead of polishing teeth, you were raking bugs off your scalp like some kind of tiny screaming orchard. These combs had fine, closely packed teeth designed to pull out the critters, their eggs, and most of your patience. Another method: boiling clothes or baking them near the fire. The heat could kill the lice, assuming you didn't burn your only tunic in the process. This is also why you might see medieval illustrations of people holding up their shirts near a flame. It wasn't laundry day. It was a pest execution. And then there was the classic technique of shaving one's head, particularly among monks or those who could get away with a bald look. Removing all hair was an effective, if dramatic, solution. Sometimes a wig was worn on top, which ironically could become its own lice hotel if not cleaned properly. Still, the logic was clear. No hair, no home for the vermin. Fleas were another problem, especially for those sleeping in straw mattresses or surrounded by animals. There weren't flea collars or bug sprays, only smoke fumigation and herbal sachets tossed between the sheets. Some believed certain smells repelled the pests. Others probably just hoped the fleas moved on to someone smellier. But the real solution was endurance. Everyone itched. Everyone scratched. It was part of life, like taxes, death, or stepping in something unspeakable near the market stalls. The medieval toilet, a term that feels wildly optimistic. Because in truth, going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was less about comfort and more about creative improvisation and lowered expectations. Let's start with the elite. Castles had guard robes, which were basically closets with a hole in a stone bench that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, and occasionally into an unfortunate patch of earth someone forgot to fence off. These were often located high up in towers for privacy and the added thrill of gravity. If you were below one, you learned quickly not to loiter. Peasants, on the other hand, had fewer luxuries. Most did their business outside, in the woods, near the river, or behind the barn. Some villages had communal pits, essentially outhouses with very low standards and even lower privacy. Your neighbor might be in there discussing crop yields mid-squat for nighttime needs. Chamber pots were the star of the show. These portable pots were tucked under beds or beside sleeping areas, ready to receive contributions in the dead of night. If you've never had the pleasure of relieving yourself into a cold ceramic bowl next to your sleeping family in the pitch dark, congratulations, you're not medieval. And what did they do with the contents of said pots? They threw them out the window literally with a hearty shout of Gardelo. Watch out for the water. Residents would dump their waste into the street below, ideally not hitting any passers-by. But let's face it, accuracy wasn't guaranteed. Sanitation was handled mostly by gravity and pigs. Cities sometimes had gutters or central ditches to carry waste away, though these often clogged, overflowed, or just sat there fermenting into a neighborhood feature. Toilet paper? Not quite. People used rags, moss, straw, their hands, or for the very refined, bits of wool or linen scraps. If that sounds unpleasant, imagine using snow in the winter, because they did before everyone collectively decided that bathing was suspicious and probably a sin. Public bathhouses were actually thriving in medieval Europe. These weren't just tubs and soap. They were the social hotspots of their day. Think of them as medieval spas with a few extra plot twists. Bathhouses offered a variety of services: hot baths, steam rooms, massage, food, music, and depending on the establishment, the occasional questionable companionship at their best. They were communal wellness centers. At their worst, they were bare-skinned dens of gossip, gluttony, and light scandal, and sometimes all three before noon. They were called stews. Not because you sat in one too long, although you might, but because of the steamy water. Mixed-gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in places like Germany or Italy, where attitudes were a bit more relaxed. It wasn't always risky. Families could attend together. Monks sometimes bathed in pairs, but human nature being what it is, boundaries got murky. So did the water. Naturally, this made bathhouses a favorite target for the church. Clerics warned that bathing in mixed company led to sin, which, to be fair, it often did. Some bathhouses subtly became brothels with plumbing. The waters got hot, and not just from the fire beneath the tub. Then came the plagues, and everything changed. When diseases like the Black Death struck, bathhouses were blamed. Doctors believed open pores invited disease, and since warm baths opened pores, well, the math added up in a way we don't know about germs. Bathhouses shut down, reputations tanked, and suddenly the public bath was out permanently. Some regions held on to the tradition a bit longer. Southern Europe, the Middle East, and certain port cities kept their stews boiling for decades more. But in Northern and Central Europe, bathhouses began to vanish faster than your dignity after slipping into a communal tub. What remained was a mix of nostalgia and paranoia. Bathhouses had been warm, lively places, but they'd also become symbols of sin, disease, and damp decision-making. By the 1500s, the average person wasn't soaking with strangers anymore. They were dabbing at their armpits with vinegar and praying for the invention of soap that didn't smell like goats. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like medicine at the time. Harsh, experimental, and likely to make you question your life choices. It technically worked, but using it felt more like punishment than self-care. The most common recipe? A hearty blend of animal fat and lye. Or, if you want to sound fancy, rendered tallow and wood ash. When combined, these ingredients created a substance that could strip dirt, oil, and possibly your soul from any surface. Early soap didn't come in pleasant pastel bars with ocean breeze scents. It came in coarse, waxy lumps that looked like something you'd avoid stepping in. To make it, You needed patience and a strong stomach. Boil down sheep or pig fat, stir in alkaline ash water, and wait while it hardens into blocks. If you added herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, you could convince yourself it was artisanal, but mostly it just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly used for laundry and heavy-duty scrubbing, not so much for the body, at least not casually. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn a bath into a mild chemical burn. Still, people used it when necessary, especially before special events like weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks. More refined soaps came from the Islamic world and southern Europe, particularly Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil instead of animal fat and far gentler on the skin. These soaps were coveted luxury goods traded across the Mediterranean and reserved for people who didn't already smell like goats on a daily basis, but for most folks, soap was a utility, not a pleasure. You used it to wash your linens, your dishes, maybe your hands, and only if they were really offensive. It wasn't part of a daily hygiene ritual. It was a monthly event like taxes or a full moon. Some people went their whole lives with minimal soap exposure and considered themselves just fine, especially when surrounded by others doing exactly the same. Communal odor has a way of setting the bar low. In medieval Europe, doing the laundry wasn't just a chore. It was a full-body workout, a community event, and a flirtation with frostbite. Forget laundromats or washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be willing to boil, beat, and beg the weather to cooperate. Most laundry was done in rivers, which sounds picturesque until you remember that these rivers also served as sewers, livestock, baths, and the occasional body disposal site. But hey, running water is running water. First you soaked your linens in lye or urine. Yes, actual human urine collected in pots and stored until it reached peak potency. Known as chamber lye, it was valued for its ammonia content, which helped lift stains and whiten fabric. The smell, less helpful. But in a time when perfume was optional and hygiene was interpretive, it did the trick after soaking. Clothes were dragged to the river, scrubbed against wooden boards or large flat stones, and then pounded with paddles, a method known as fulling. It was less gentle washing and more clothes interrogation. This process could take hours and often involved the collective effort of washerwomen who were both feared and admired for their arm strength. Then came the rinsing and the wringing and the drying, which, if it rained, meant waiting another day, but hoping your shirt didn't develop new sentience. Clothes were often spread across bushes, hedges, or stretched on lines between trees and peasant huts. Medieval villages had the charming aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. Of course, not everyone did their own laundry. Wealthy households had servants, monasteries had lay brothers, and some towns even had professional washers. But for most people, it was DIY or nothing. Interestingly, clean clothes were more important than clean bodies. You might not have bathed in a month, but if your linen shift was bright and fresh smelling, relatively speaking, you were considered presentable. In some cases, laundry was your hygiene. After 14 chapters of scratching, scrubbing, sniffing, and surviving, the question must finally be asked: did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion? The short answer: it worked well enough. Not by modern standards, of course. If you were to time travel back to 1347, your nostrils would probably file for divorce. But in their own context, medieval folks weren't completely oblivious to cleanliness. They simply operated on a different scale of what counted as clean. They had systems. Even if those systems involved vinegar foot soaks and chamber pots hurled out windows, they had tools, lice combs, linen layers, vinegar, herbs, ash-based soap. They had rituals too. Whether it was sponge bathing before Sunday Mass or boiling one's underwear on a full moon, hygiene existed. It was just deeply interwoven with fear, faith, and the weather in many ways. Medieval people were doing the best they could with what they had, while also constantly trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own armpits. The idea of regular full-body bathing was risky, time-consuming, and thanks to church doctrine and plague fears, seen as medically unwise. So they got inventive. And surprisingly, some practices aged well. Linen undergarments were hygienically smart. Herb-infused water and vinegar rinses. Pretty solid antibacterial logic. Even communal bathhouses were effective until they turned into hot tubs of gossip and syphilis. But yes, people smelled. They scratched. They shared baths, lice, and deeply misinformed medical advice. Yet many lived to see old age, or at least a second harvest, despite the hygiene horrors. So while their standards were, let's say, fluid, they weren't without effort. Hygiene was more of a social signal than a science. Clean clothes equaled virtue. Shiny hair, or at least less itchy hair, meant discipline, and avoiding full body rot was just good manners. In the end, medieval hygiene worked in the same way that balancing a wagon wheel with twine works, barely, but impressively considering the tools. Imagine walking through a city over 4,500 years old and realizing it's laid out with more precision than some modern suburbs. Welcome to Mohenjo-Daro, the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you were expecting dusty huts and random alleyways, think again. This place was so well planned it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro wasn't thrown together like a festival campsite. It was meticulously organized. The city was laid out in a grid pattern. Yes, actual blocks and right angles. Streets ran north to south and east to west, intersecting cleanly and forming a neat network of roads. It was as if the architects used a ruler and said, let's keep this geometric. But the real magic wasn't just on the surface. Underneath those dusty roads was a system that even 21st century cities often failed to maintain drainage. Mohenjo-Daro had an underground sewer system. Almost every house, no matter how small, had access to water and drainage. Wastewater flowed from homes into covered drains running alongside the streets. You could almost hear the ancient residents saying, yes, actually, sanitation matters. The city wasn't just a giant bathroom with bricks, though. It was zoned with intention. There was a citadel on a raised mound, probably home to administrative or religious elites, and a lower city where the general population lived. Public buildings like the famed Great Bath suggest that this wasn't just about survival. There was ritual, maybe even recreation, soaked into the clay bricks. Markets likely thrived along the main streets, and houses varied in size, indicating social stratification, but even the modest homes had private wells and toilets. Let that sink in. People with fewer means still had indoor plumbing for millennia ago. Meanwhile, many 19th century Europeans were still throwing waste out of windows. And then mystery. The city was eventually abandoned. No sign of conquest, no dramatic fire, just silence. Perhaps climate shifts, perhaps trade disruption. But whatever the cause, the legacy of Mohenjo-Daro endures. A city built with intent, intelligence, and a disturbing awareness that clean water and zoning laws actually matter. And they didn't even have an urban planning department. Go figure. If Mohenjo-Daro was the tidy accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the theatrical celebrity. Flashy, vast, and drenched in myth, Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. It rose and fell many times over the centuries, but in its prime, around the 6th century BCE, under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the glittering heart of Mesopotamia. Now don't let the poetry fool you. This place was as carefully planned as it was majestic. Babylon was a walled city with massive gates, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate, adorned with dazzling blue tiles and sacred lions that looked like they belonged in a dream sequence. And no, it wasn't just decorative. That gate was part of a carefully orchestrated urban layout. At the center of Babylon's design was a sacred axis, a processional way that ran straight through the city. This wasn't just a road, it was a parade route for gods. Literally religious festivals like the Akidu. The New Year festival would proceed along this street, linking the great Edmunanke ziggurat, which may or may not have inspired the story of the Tower of Babel, to the mighty Esagila temple, dedicated to the god Marduk. Urban planning here was part piety, part propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked its holy narrative every day. Babylon's streets curved with the river and obeyed the land's contours, but they were also zoned smartly. There were residential quarters, temple complexes, gardens, markets, and administrative centers. The Euphrates River sliced through the city, providing not only water, but also a navigable artery for trade, commerce, and, let's be honest, showing off. Drainage systems were present, though not quite as refined as in the Indus Valley. Still, homes had bathrooms with clay pipes and canals to move wastewater away. Babylonian engineers were clearly not amateurs. Even bricks bore inscriptions of the king's name, because if you're going to build sewers, you might as well brand them. Babylon was a city designed to impress both mortals and gods. Every street, every gate, every temple was a statement. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and marvel at the zoning permits. And people did. Even Alexander the Great reportedly planned to make Babylon his capital. Because once you walked down a street made for a god, Athens probably felt a bit underwhelming. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs marveled at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born, this ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design skills. At its peak, around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population north of 100,000. And unlike the chaotic sprawl of some modern megacities, this place was deliberately mapped out with the precision of a sacred geometry student who never forgot their protractor. The city's most iconic feature, the Avenue of the Dead. Despite its morbid name, thanks Aztecs, it was less a cemetery and more a ceremonial boulevard, stretching over 2 miles. This Grand Ave was no accident. It was a central axis aligned with astronomical events. And flanked by temples, plazas, elite residences, and bustling market zones, it connected the Pyramid of the Moon at the north with the enormous Pyramid of the Sun, creating a sacred spine that structured the entire city. Now, here's where things get even more advanced. Teotihuacan's layout was orthogonal. The whole city followed a grid system tilted about 15.5 degrees off true north, possibly to align with specific celestial phenomena or sacred mountains. It wasn't random, it was cosmological. This was urban planning with a cosmic compass and zoning. Absolutely. Residential compounds were laid out in modular blocks, often housing multiple families with access to shared patios and drainage systems. Some compounds were highly decorated, indicating wealth, while others showed a more communal working-class lifestyle. This wasn't just a city. It was an organized society made visible in stone and stucco. Teotihuacan also had a complex water management system. Canals and drains ran alongside streets and through residential zones, helping to prevent flooding in the rainy season. Engineers clearly understood their environment and planned accordingly. You get the sense they would have been deeply offended by potholes. There's still much we don't know who ruled, how power was structured. But we do know this. The city was built to impress both the eyes and the skies. Teotihuacan was a blueprint of order, combining ritual with rationality. And when the Aztecs stumbled upon its towering ruins centuries later, they didn't just admire it, they assumed gods must have built it. Honestly, after seeing the symmetry, who could blame them? When we talk about ancient urban planning, it's tempting to imagine a single mastermind. The ancient version of a city architect with a scroll and a vision. But in the Indus Valley civilization, it seems the planning came not from a ruler's decree, but from a cultural consensus so strong that multiple cities across the region, from Harappa to Lodhal, share shockingly similar features. These weren't sister cities. They were practically architectural clones. And that says something profound. Take Harappa, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan. Like Mohenjo-Daro, it too was laid out in a grid-like pattern with uniform brick sizes, clear zoning for industrial, residential, and administrative use, and you guessed it, advanced drainage systems. Each home was connected to street drains via private chutes or underground terracotta pipes. This wasn't just sanitation, it was dignity by design. Ensuring that even common citizens had clean facilities, Lodhal, another Indus city near the Arabian Sea, added a new layer of sophistication port planning. Yes, Lodhal had a dockyard, possibly the earliest known in the world, complete with a massive basin and sluice gates to control water levels. This wasn't just a riverside outpost. It was a shipping hub with infrastructure that anticipated tides and flow patterns. And you thought Venice was clever. What makes it even more remarkable is that there's no evidence of kings, palaces, or military fortresses, no statues of ruling elites, no epic inscriptions boasting about victories. Instead, the cities seem to have been run by efficient bureaucracies or councils focused on hygiene, trade, and ritual. Their power came from engineering, not empire artifacts like standardized weights and measures. Suggest a deeply regulated economy with designated market areas and craft zones. You could almost imagine ancient planning committees arguing over warehouse placement and sewer width, because these decisions were made and they stuck across hundreds of miles. And they weren't just building for the elite. The uniformity in home construction, access to water, and public amenities like baths and wells point to an urban ideal that was collective, not hierarchical. The real architects of the Indus cities weren't just building towns. They were shaping a society where order was embedded in every brick and where planning wasn't a privilege. It was a principle. When we think of zoning today, we picture bureaucrats arguing over parking permits and whether someone's Airbnb violates residential codes. But zoning, dividing a city into designated areas for living, working, worshiping, and dumping your garbage, isn't modern. It's ancient and surprisingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random clusters of buildings. They were carefully orchestrated spaces, each with a logic behind the layout. Let's start with Mohenjo-Daro again. There, the raised citadel housed public baths, granaries, and possibly administrative buildings. Below it lay the residential quarters, with broad avenues separating them. Workshops and kilns were kept at the edges, probably because nobody wanted their home filled with smoke and clanging pottery wheels. It's zoning by common sense. But the impressive part is that this model repeated across Indus cities. Now jump over to Babylon. Babylonian zoning was driven not just by utility, but also by ritual and propaganda. Temples and palaces dominated the city's heart. Linked by ceremonial routes, administrative buildings and elite homes clustered nearby, while commoners and markets were pushed outward. But everyone, rich or poor, lived under the same city layout philosophy, organized, purposeful, and impressively sophisticated. Then there's Teotihuacan. Here, zoning reached almost surgical precision. The city's layout followed a strict grid, but each sector had a clear identity. There were residential compounds, craft production zones, market areas, and temple complexes, all coordinated like parts of a body. Some compounds even housed immigrants, entire neighborhoods of people from Oaxaca or the Gulf Coast, each built in the architectural style of their homeland. It was zoning plus multiculturalism in 500 CE. This level of spatial organization shows one critical thing. These weren't just cities. They were intentional societies. Urban space reflected values, be they spiritual, political, or economic. Where you lived, where you worked, where you worshipped. These were all pre-mapped by people who understood not only how humans move, but how they relate. And no, they didn't need modern GIS software, just observation, engineering, and maybe a divine mandate or two. Because when a society can enforce zoning laws without Twitter outrage or lawsuits, you know their urban planning game was ahead of its time. We love to imagine the ancient world as gloriously filthy, muddy streets, chamber pots, and the unmistakable perfume of unwashed crowds. But the truth? Some ancient cities cared a lot about sanitation. In fact, several had public hygiene systems that would make a 19th century European blush. Let's return to Mohenjo-Daro, our sanitation superstar. Nearly every house, regardless of size, had its own private bathing area, complete with a sloped floor to drain water. Wastewater was channeled into covered drains. Yes, covered drains, lined with bricks and equipped with access holes for cleaning. The drains ran along nearly every street, carrying waste away from the city. It was basically an early version of municipal plumbing. This was not just clever, it was revolutionary. Compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was more symbolic. The city had canals and some drainage channels, and clay pipes carried water into palaces and temples. But for the average citizen, sanitation involved cesspits, open ditches, and divine forgiveness. Still, bathrooms were common, and wealthier homes had indoor plumbing using clay piping. Some records even describe a rudimentary flushing system, likely involving buckets and good timing. Now let's zoom into Teotihuacan. Though not as obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley, Teotihuacan still featured carefully engineered stormwater canals and separate sewage systems in elite compounds. Many residential complexes had internal drains, and public buildings often had designated latrines. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort. It was likely tied to religious purity, especially in ritual areas like temples or the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller cities in the ancient world, like Lathal and Harappa, reflect a deep understanding of hydrology, with wells, reservoirs, and strategically sloped streets to prevent flooding. Imagine planning an entire town with gravity and seasonal monsoons in mind, and then pulling it off in 2400 BCE. What makes all of this impressive isn't just the tech, it's the mindset. These civilizations viewed water not just as a necessity, but as something to be channeled, shared, and respected. Hygiene wasn't a luxury for the elite. It was embedded in the urban design itself. Modern cities still struggle with waste management. These ancients, they were already digging trenches and laying bricks, quietly reminding us that flushing. It is a civilizational achievement. If temples were where ancient people spoke to the gods, markets were where they negotiated with each other and likely argued over the price of onions. Every ancient city we've explored so far had a beating economic heart, and that heart pulsed in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and economic zoning. In Babylon, markets were not a chaotic afterthought squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban grid and regulated by law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal texts, devotes dozens of clauses to trade practices, weights, measures, and merchant behavior. Markets bustle with activity under porticos and open-air squares. Grains, textiles, wine, slaves, and livestock changed hands while scribes tracked debts and transactions. This wasn't just shopping. It was commerce with legal infrastructure. Now shift to Teotihuacan, where things get even more fascinating. The city hosted enormous market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela complex, where thousands gathered to trade obsidian tools, cacao, feathers, ceramics, and salt. Unlike the highly centralized temple economies of some cultures, Teotihuacan's market system appeared decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in specific crafts. Think of it as an ancient version of local Etsy shops, except your supplier lived in the next compound. Meanwhile, in Mohenjo-daro and other Indus cities, the urban layout reveals designated bazaar zones with wide avenues and adjacent warehouses. Archaeologists have uncovered standardized weights and scales, suggesting a robust system of regulation. Goods from as far away as Mesopotamia, including seals and precious stones, have been found in Indus sites, indicating that international trade was a thing. Imagine your neighborhood fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian currency and not even blinking. But it wasn't just about money. Markets were social hubs. In Babylon, they were places to catch gossip, settle disputes, and see who was wearing the latest Assyrian tunic. In Teotihuacan, they were multicultural melting pots, with traders and travelers from distant lands mingling among pyramids. Even the Indus cities, which lacked grand palaces or temples, prioritized economic zones in their design. Trade drove innovation. It demanded roads, regulation, and records, and ancient urban planners responded not with chaos, but with structure. Behind every sacred temple or fortress wall, there was a merchant yelling the best price in the city. In the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts. It was about the gods. Temples weren't hidden in quiet corners. They dominated skylines, sat atop the city's highest points, and demanded prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone knew it. Start with Babylon. The skyline was pierced by the Etemenanke Ziggurat, a multi-tiered mountain of baked brick dedicated to the god Marduk. It was no modest shrine. It was an architectural flex measuring around 91 meters high. If ancient sources are to be believed, it was meant to bridge heaven and earth. And this wasn't just spiritual, it was centralized urban messaging. Roads led to the temple, ceremonies revolved around it, and the entire city bowed architecturally and ritually to its divine core. Teotihuacan, too, placed its spiritual heart front and center. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ceremonial structures, they were urban anchors. The Avenue of the Dead connected these temples like a celestial path, aligning with astronomical events and possibly even solstices. Everything from residential compounds to market spaces seemed to radiate out from these temples. They weren't background props. They were cosmic coordinates, guiding both foot traffic and philosophy. And then there's Mohenjo-Daro, which didn't have towering ziggurats or pyramids, but instead gave us the Great Bath, a large public water tank likely used for ritual purification. This wasn't just a swimming hole. It was engineered with watertight bricks, a sophisticated drain system, and possibly linked to spiritual practices of cleanliness and rebirth. No idle-lined sanctuaries here, just water, geometry, and silence. In all these cities, sacred spaces were deliberately placed and functionally integrated. The temples weren't isolated. They were connected to processional roads, public courtyards, and administrative centers. Worship wasn't separate from life. It was life. Urban planning reflected this unity. These were not secular societies with temples. They were sacred landscapes disguised as cities. Every brick laid, every St. carved, every plaza placed was part of a larger spiritual choreography. Because in the ancient world, to build a city was to make an offering, and the gods always got the best seat in the house. It's tempting to think of modern cities as products of innovation, blueprints, and civil engineering degrees. But dig a little deeper literally, and you'll find that the bones of urban life were laid thousands of years ago by planners without concrete bulldozers or CAD software. The DNA of city planning, grids, zoning, sanitation, civic centers, religious spaces was already etched into the earth by people we often underestimate. Take drainage. Mohenjo-Daro didn't just throw down a few ditches. They designed an integrated, multi-level wastewater system that ran through homes and beneath streets. The concept of universal access to sanitation, still elusive in parts of the modern world, was a standard in this Bronze Age metropolis. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated commerce, civic infrastructure, and the symbolic use of space to reinforce power and religion. Teotihuacan gave us the template of the cosmic city, one where every RD, plaza, and temple pointed to something bigger than the human eye could see. Its builders connected astronomy to architecture, embedding celestial rhythms into everyday movement. These weren't just settlements, they were philosophical blueprints. And then there's the psychological aspect. Ancient cities influenced behavior. Wide avenues allowed for processions and parades. Enclosed courtyards created communal spaces. Zoning wasn't just practical, it shaped how people interacted, how neighborhoods formed, and how authority was visualized. These choices told people where to gather, what was sacred, and how to live in harmony, or at least try. Modern urban planning owes much to this ancient foresight. Grids in Manhattan, sanitation in Amsterdam, temples turned into cathedrals, turned into town halls. Even the idea of a civic center comes from these ancestral cityscapes. We still measure property. We still design cities around access, trade, spirituality, and spectacle. What's changed is the technology, not the principle. And while we pave highways and direct skyscrapers, the core remains. Cities are stories we write in stone, brick, and steel, and the first chapters of that story. They were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. Hadrian was not born in the heart of Rome, but on its distant western fringe. He came into the world in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. Though geographically far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, elite, and thoroughly Roman in culture and ambition. Most importantly, his father's side was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the man who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both of his parents at around age 10, a formative tragedy that thrust him into the guardianship of Trajan and Publius Basilius Aetianus, a Romanite. These two men would shape the trajectory of his life. While many young nobles were steered toward military or political careers, Hadrian gravitated toward Greek literature, philosophy, and the arts. He spoke Greek fluently and read Homer obsessively, and preferred a scroll to a sword, at least early on. Rome, of course, didn't run on poetry, so Hadrian, as all ambitious Roman aristocrats did, had to earn his place through service. He began as a military tribune, first in Lower Moesia, then in Upper Moesia, and finally in Pannonia. He proved himself a competent officer, but his deeper talents lay in administration and statecraft. Trajan's rise to the emperor in 98 CE marked a turning point for Hadrian. Though their relationship was sometimes strained, Hadrian was known for being sharp-tongued, arrogant, and a bit too intellectual for some. Trajan nonetheless kept him close. Hadrian became a quaestor, then tribune of the plebs, and steadily climbed the cursus honorum, Rome's ladder of political advancement. He also married well. His bride was Vibia Sabina, Trajan's grandniece, a politically strategic union, though not a happy one. The marriage was likely loveless and distant, as Hadrian's personal interests leaned more toward philosophical companionship and male intimacy, especially in the case of his later beloved Antonius. Hadrian's early life was defined by this tension between military expectation and artistic temperament. He was a man from the edge of the empire, yet destined to lead it, not through brute force, but through calculated grace. In a world of conquest, he was already dreaming of marble columns and philosophical dialogue. When Emperor Trajan fell gravely ill in 117 CE, the question of succession became urgent and murky. Though Hadrian had long served in the imperial orbit, his claim to the throne wasn't universally accepted. Trajan had never publicly named a successor, and the political elite were divided over whether Hadrian, the aloof intellectual from Hispania, was truly the right man to lead Rome. Trajan died in Selinus in Asia Minor, far from the capital. Conveniently or suspiciously within days, a letter arrived in Rome stating that Trajan had adopted Hadrian as his son on his deathbed, witnessed by Trajan's wife Pladna and the ever-loyal Aetianus. The timing was impeccable. Some senators whispered forgery. Others suspected that Pladna had orchestrated the whole affair, favoring Hadrian's administrative mind over the more militaristic candidates. Regardless of the circumstances, the Senate ratified Hadrian's accession, and he became emperor on August 11, 117 CE. But the transition was far from smooth. Almost immediately, Hadrian faced a crisis. The empire had overextended under Trajan's military campaigns, particularly in Mesopotamia, where rebellion was brewing. Rather than continue aggressive expansion, Hadrian made the pragmatic and unpopular choice to withdraw from Trajan's eastern conquests, including Armenia and Mesopotamia. This angered many senators and military men who had bled for those victories. Hadrian was accused of cowardice, even betrayal, and then came the bloodbath. Shortly after his ascension, four prominent senators who had openly opposed Hadrian's rise were executed under vague charges of conspiracy. Hadrian publicly denied involvement, blaming Aetianus, but few believed him. This act permanently tainted his relationship with the Senate, even as he tried to govern with restraint and lawfulness. The message was clear. Hadrian could philosophize like a Greek, but he would rule like a Roman. Despite political turbulence, Hadrian's first acts as emperor revealed his priorities. He canceled debts, distributed money to the poor, and secured military loyalty with generous donatives. He made a symbolic break from endless conquest and began refocusing Rome's energy inward on consolidation, infrastructure, and stability. Hadrian may have come to power through whispered corridors and shadowy signatures, but once in the purple, he wasted no time in making the empire his own. Hadrian wasn't content to rule from the comfort of marble halls in Rome. Unlike most emperors, he saw the empire not as a distant abstraction, but as a living, breathing landscape, and he was determined to walk it. From the moment he secured his throne, Hadrian set out on a mission to visit nearly every province under his control. It wasn't ceremonial. It was hands-on governance, inspection, correction, diplomacy, and vision, all wrapped in sandals and sweat. Over the next 2 decades, Hadrian would log more miles than any emperor before or after him. His first major tour began in 121 CE and lasted nearly 5 years. He traveled through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Hispania, Africa, The Balkans, Greece, and Asia Minor, not by chariot, but often on foot. Aye. Alongside his soldiers, it was part leadership, part spectacle. In Britannia, Hadrian witnessed firsthand the instability along Rome's northern frontier. The Caledonian tribes, future Scots, were relentless. Rome had pushed too far, and Hadrian opted to pull back and fortify. The result was his most famous legacy, Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile-long stone barrier stretching across northern England. It wasn't just military. It was psychological. A statement of limits. Rome would defend what it had, not reach endlessly for more. In Africa, he inspected fortresses and addressed infrastructure. In Asia Minor, he funded public works and temples. In Egypt, he was treated like a living god and nearly drowned on the Nile. Everywhere he went, he tied the empire together through appearances, policy, and architectural patronage. But his favorite stop was always Greece. Hadrian adored Hellenic culture, its language, philosophy, and aesthetics. He participated in the Eleusinian Mysteries, patronized philosophers, and even earned the nickname Gregulus in his youth. He wasn't insulted. He leaned into it. In Athens, he financed the completion of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, began construction of the Library of Hadrian, and sought to revive the Pan-Hellenic League, uniting Greek cities under cultural pride. His travels weren't vacations, they were statecraft. By physically appearing in every corner of the empire, Hadrian reminded the provinces they were not forgotten. He wasn't just the emperor in Rome, he was the emperor on their roads, in their markets, inspecting their temples, and sharing their dust. Hadrian didn't just walk the empire, he reimagined it in stone. He was a builder by passion, not just policy. His reign marked a golden age of imperial architecture, where concrete and marble became tools of philosophy, power, and cultural fusion. Wherever he went, Hadrian left behind arches, aqueducts, baths, theaters, and temples, not just as monuments, but as blueprints for a unified empire. Perhaps his most iconic contribution within Rome itself was the Pantheon. Rebuilt under his orders around 126 CE, while Agrippa's earlier version had burned down, Hadrian's vision transformed it into one of the most enduring buildings in history. With its massive dome and oculus, the Pantheon became a marvel of Roman engineering and a symbol of the heavens touching the earth. It was religious, geometric, cosmic, and deeply Hadrianic. Then there was his villa at Tivoli, a sprawling complex east of Rome. That became both a retreat and a laboratory. Unlike typical imperial villas, Hadrian's estate was a curated architectural portfolio. It replicated famous landmarks from across the empire, Egyptian colonnades, Greek stoas, and even a miniature canal modeled on the Nile. This wasn't a villa. It was a philosopher king's dreamscape, a statement that Rome encompassed all worlds across the provinces. He launched massive infrastructure campaigns. In Athens, he completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus, a project abandoned for centuries. In North Africa, he funded roads, aqueducts, and granaries. In Asia Minor and the Levant, he rebuilt cities ravaged by earthquakes. In Jerusalem, he controversially refounded the city as Aelia Capitolina, sparking outrage among the Jewish population, an act that would have consequences later. Hadrian's architectural style was as eclectic as his travels. He loved arches, symmetry, and domes, but he also incorporated Greek aesthetics, Egyptian motifs, and local materials. He didn't force Roman identity on the provinces. He wove their traditions into imperial fabric. Architecture for Hadrian wasn't just about utility or beauty. It was a philosophy in stone, a silent way of saying Rome is not just a place. It is an idea, and this is what it looks like. Through bricks and mortar, Hadrian didn't just preserve the empire, he defined its soul. Among the many people who walked beside Hadrian during his travels, none would leave a deeper emotional imprint than Antinous, a beautiful young man from Bithynia in Asia Minor. Their relationship, tender, controversial, and ultimately tragic, would shape the emperor's personal mythology and produce one of the most unusual cults in Roman history. Antinous first appears in Hadrian's life around 124 CE, likely as a teenage companion. Described in ancient sources as stunningly handsome, quiet, and obedient, Antinous became Hadrian's favorite, accompanying him on journeys throughout the empire, especially in Greece and Egypt. Their relationship, while never officially defined, was widely understood to be romantic. In a society where emperors often wielded absolute power over courtly relationships, Hadrian's bond with Antonis stood out for its intensity and visibility. But in 130 CE, tragedy struck. While sailing along the Nile, Antonis drowned under mysterious circumstances. The details are vague. Some say it was an accident, others whisper of ritual sacrifice, and still others suggest suicide. Whatever the truth, Hadrian was devastated. He openly mourned his companion in ways no Roman emperor ever had before. His grief was public, passionate, and enduring. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of imperial memorial in history. Hadrian deified Antonis. He founded a city near the site of his death, Antinopolis, and established cults in his honor throughout the empire. Statues of the young man were commissioned by the hundreds. His image, always idealized and serene, became a new icon of beauty and divine youth. Temples, coins, festivals, and even oracles were devoted to Antonis. In many ways, he became a kind of pagan saint, a god of grief, rebirth, and male beauty. No imperial lover had ever been honored like this. And for Hadrian, it wasn't political theater. It was personal mythology, written in stone and marble across continents. The cult of Antonis persisted long after Hadrian's death. His statues outlived empires. His name echoed in the writings of poets and travelers. Through Antonis, Hadrian didn't just immortalize love. He challenged the empire's understanding of what could be divine. Hadrian's reign, though often marked by art, philosophy, and travel, was not without fire, and none burned hotter than the Bar Kokhba revolt, the most violent Jewish uprising against Roman rule. It would test the emperor's patience, reveal his ruthless streak, and leave deep scars on the province of Judea. The seeds of rebellion were sown when Hadrian, in an effort to unify the empire under Roman civic religion, attempted to refound Jerusalem as a Roman colony. Aelia Capitolina, named after his own family name and dedicated to Jupiter. To make matters worse, he reportedly planned to build a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Second Temple, Judaism's holiest site. Whether this was cultural insensitivity or political provocation, it was seen by the Jewish population as sacrilege. In 132 CE, rebellion erupted under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba. A charismatic and militant figure hailed by some as the Messiah, his forces quickly overwhelmed Roman garrisons and retook Jerusalem, establishing a short-lived Jewish state. For 2 years, Bar Kokhba ruled as a de facto prince, minting coins and enforcing Jewish law. Hadrian, initially caught off guard, responded with cold, strategic fury. He summoned his best generals, including Julius Severus, recalled from Britain, and amassed an overwhelming force. What followed was brutal counterinsurgency warfare. Roman troops crushed village after village, deploying scorched earth tactics, siege warfare, and mass executions. No mercy was shown to rebels or civilians suspected of aiding them. By 135 CE, the revolt was over. Bar Kokhba was dead. The province was devastated. Over 500,000 Jews were killed. According to Roman sources, and countless others were enslaved, Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate move to erase Jewish ties to the land. Jewish religious practices were restricted and the population scattered. Hadrian, once the emperor of architecture and elegance, had shown his iron fist. His rule over Judea remains one of the darkest chapters of his reign, one marked not by roads or domes, but by fire, ashes, and exile. It was a harsh reminder. Hadrian could love books, gods, and boys, but if challenged, he would rule with Roman steel. After years of restless travel, monumental construction, and both diplomacy and brutality, Hadrian began to slow down. The final phase of his life was marked by illness, melancholy, and the deepening sense that even emperors cannot master mortality. The man who had walked the empire in sandals now rarely left his villa, and the philosopher king grew increasingly reclusive and morbid. By 133 CE, Hadrian was suffering from a chronic illness, likely a form of heart disease or kidney failure. Based on ancient descriptions of his bloating, weakness, and difficulty breathing, he grew irritable, depressed, and obsessed with his own death. He began composing poetry about mortality, often bleak and introspective. One of his most famous verses is a whispered farewell to his soul, Animula, Vagula, Blandula, a reflection on the fragility of life and the limits of power. But as his body failed, he still had one final imperial duty, naming a successor. Hadrian had no biological children, and his political instincts were clouded by personal affection. In 136 CE, he adopted Lucius Sionius Commodus, known as Lucius Aelius Caesar, a relatively obscure senator with a reputation for charm but poor health. Many were puzzled. The man was stylish, possibly soft, and clearly not built to rule. Their doubts were justified. Just months after his adoption, Aelius died suddenly, probably from tuberculosis. Hadrian was devastated and once again scrambling to find a suitable heir. With time running out, he turned to a more traditional choice, Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a respected moderate senator. In 138 CE, Hadrian adopted Antoninus, but with a twist. He demanded that Antoninus in turn adopt Marcus Annius Verus, the young man who would later become Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. In this one act, Hadrian effectively engineered the next 2 generations of stable leadership, but didn't ease his suffering. He retreated to his beloved villa at Tivoli, where he spent his final days surrounded by memories, sculptures, and the ghost of Antinous. His condition worsened, and in the end he attempted suicide multiple times, only to be prevented by his attendants. His death finally came in July 138 CE at age 62. Hadrian's ashes were placed in a mausoleum he built for himself, a towering cylinder on the Tiber, later known as Castel Sant'Angelo. When Hadrian died in 138 CE, he left behind no empire expanded, but one far more secure, cohesive, and intellectually vibrant than he had found it. His reign was not defined by conquest like Trajan's, but by consolidation, and that in hindsight was a revolutionary act. In an age obsessed with outward glory, Hadrian had the clarity and audacity to look inward. The most visible reminders of his rule still stand. Hadrian's Wall, stretching across northern Britain, became a symbol of imperial strength, not through aggression, but through boundaries. It said, "This is Rome, and that is not." It wasn't just military, it was philosophical. The empire had limits, and knowing them was wise in the capital. His reconstruction of the Pantheon changed architectural history. Its vast dome remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It was a temple not just to the gods, but to the possibility of Roman engineering and imagination. It is the physical embodiment of Hadrian's intellect, precise, timeless and open to the sky. His villa at Tivoli, with its libraries, water gardens, and recreated temples, became the model for Renaissance palaces centuries later. It was Hadrian's dream of the world, an empire reduced to art and landscape. But Hadrian's legacy wasn't only made of stone, it was also etched in policy and precedent. He reformed Roman law, reorganized the military without constant warfare, and professionalized provincial administration. He visited his provinces not to dazzle them, but to understand them, leaving behind a new model of imperial responsibility. Culturally, his love of Greek philosophy, poetry, and sculpture helped spark a revival of Hellenic traditions across the Roman world. The man once mocked as Graculius had in effect re-Hellenized the empire, not by force, but by taste. And politically, Hadrian's choice of Antoninus Pius and the adoption of Marcus Aurelius ensured an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity, later called the Pax Antonina. His foresight birthed the so-called Five Good Emperors, a run of stability unmatched in Roman history. Yet he remained a paradox, a builder who was destroyed in Judea, a lover of peace with a hidden iron fist. A student of beauty who governed with realism, Hadrian's Rome wasn't just marble and might. It was mind, memory, and measure. Hadrian didn't just rule Rome. He reimagined what it meant to be emperor. His reign stands at the crossroads of military command and philosophical inquiry, of tradition and reinvention. In many ways, Hadrian marked a turning point. The moment the Roman emperor stopped being merely a warlord-in-chief and became a curator of civilization. Unlike his predecessors, Hadrian projected power through presence rather than expansion. By walking the roads, visiting garrisons, inspecting aqueducts, and debating with philosophers, He transformed emperorship into a performance of omnipresent responsibility. The toga and the scroll became as essential as the sword. This shift influenced how future emperors would see their role. His immediate successors, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, embraced this vision. They ruled not as conquerors, but as stewards of Roman order, focused on justice, infrastructure, and cultural refinement. Marcus Aurelius, with his meditations, might never have emerged had Hadrian not elevated philosophy into imperial legitimacy. Hadrian also embodied the paradoxes of power. He was both adored and feared, elegant yet cruel when provoked. His reign was calm by comparison, but beneath it lay authoritarian reflexes. The executions of senators, the crushing of the Bar Kokhba for revolt, the exile of dissenters. These revealed a man who preached moderation but wielded authority with surgical ruthlessness when challenged privately. Hadrian was introspective and melancholic. His poetry, especially late in life, reveals a man aware of his mortality and contradictions. His love for Antinous, idealized, deified, and mourned, offered an emotional counterweight to his public image. That grief made him human, and it echoes centuries later as a rare moment of imperial vulnerability. Even in death, Hadrian crafted a legacy of enduring presence. His mausoleum, now Rome's Castel Sant'Angelo, stands as a fortress against forgetting. His buildings still define skylines. His laws inform generations. His travels stitched together a multicultural empire into something that, at least briefly, felt united. Hadrian's greatness lies not in what he conquered, but in what he conserved, built, and imagined. He was a paradox with a laurel crown, architect and autocrat, poet and emperor, human and enigma. In the end, Hadrian didn't just leave behind monuments. He left behind a model of emperorship itself, one that still haunts the ruins of Rome and the minds of those who walk them. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen. The Louisiana Purchase and $15 million deal with France added over 800,000 square miles of mostly uncharted wilderness to the young republic. It was a geopolitical coup, but also a massive cartographic question mark. What exactly had America just bought? Mountains, deserts, water routes, monsters. Jefferson had no clue, but he was determined to find out. Enter Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's personal secretary, and a man with an insatiable appetite for adventure and scientific notebooks. Jefferson handpicked him to lead an expedition to explore the new territory, map its geography, document its flora and fauna, and most importantly, determine if a water route to the Pacific, the mythical Northwest Passage, actually existed. But Lewis wasn't going alone. He chose his old friend and military comrade, William Clark, as co-leader. While Lewis had a mind for science and diplomacy, Clark brought military discipline, cartographic skill, and an easy rapport with men, a balance Jefferson believed essential. They would be equal leaders, despite the fact that only Lewis held a formal commission. Their unity would become one of the expedition's greatest strengths. Preparations began immediately. Jefferson provided detailed instructions. Observe the landscape. Establish trade with native tribes, study plant and animal life, and assert American presence in lands already occupied by dozens of indigenous nations. Subtle diplomacy wrapped in scientific curiosity. Supplies were gathered, compasses, sextants, microscopes, gifts for native leaders like beads, mirrors, and peace medals, and even a collapsible iron frame boat, one that never quite worked but looked great on paper. Dozens of men were recruited, mostly from the U.S. Army. This group would become the core of Discovery, a name as ambitious as the journey itself. The expedition launched from Camp Du Bois near St. Louis in May 1804. Ahead of them lay thousands of miles of unknown terrain, countless tribal nations, and a mission with no guarantee of return. But for Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark, the prize wasn't just land, it was knowledge, the kind that would transform America's future and define its frontier spirit. And so, with maps unwritten and journals blank, the cause of discovery set off into the wilderness, chasing a vision only barely glimpsed through Jefferson's dreams. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery pushed off from the banks of the Missouri River, beginning what would become a 2-year odyssey into lands few Americans had ever seen. Their departure was quiet. No parades, no cheering crowds. Just 33 men in a keel boat and two pirogues hauling nearly 10 tons of supplies upstream into the wild. Their progress was slow. The Missouri River, while their main highway westward, was deceptively treacherous. Shifting sandbars, powerful currents, and dense forests made travel a daily grind. The men used poles, ropes, oars, and sheer will to inch forward against the flow. At times it must have felt like rowing through wet cement. The crew consisted of hardened frontiersmen, expert hunters, French-Canadian boatmen, and a few soldiers with more grit than Polish. Among them were York, Clark's enslaved servant, whose strength and charisma would later earn him deep respect from native tribes, and Charles Floyd, a sergeant whose fate would remind them all how fragile life on the frontier could be. The team quickly fell into a disciplined routine. The cartographer mapped every bend in the river. Lewis, the naturalist, cataloged flora, fauna, and geological features, collecting samples and describing everything from catfish to mosquitoes with obsessive detail. Every day they encountered new creatures, some majestic like bald eagles and elk, and others less welcome. Gnats, ticks, and biting flies became daily tortures. By late summer they reached what is now Iowa and South Dakota, where the landscape transformed into sweeping prairies and endless sky. It was here they had their first significant diplomatic meetings with native tribes, including the Oto in Missouri and later the Teton Sioux. These encounters were tense. Lewis and Clark carried peace medals and flags, symbols of American goodwill, but also power. The message was clear. A new nation had arrived, and it intended to be known still. Mistrust simmered beneath smiles. The expedition was often outnumbered and outgunned. Diplomacy wasn't optional. It was survival. Missteps could spell disaster. Yet through brute strength, cooperation, and careful tact, the Corps continued upriver. They hadn't even reached winter yet, but the tone was set. This journey would demand endurance, humility, and nerve. And Missouri? She was just getting warmed up. By the time autumn 1804 crept across the Great Plains, the Missouri River had begun to slow under the weight of the coming freeze. The cause of discovery had traveled over 1,000 miles from St. Louis, and they knew they wouldn't make it to the Rocky Mountains before snow sealed the way west. It was time to pause, regroup, and survive. They chose a spot near present-day Washburn, North Dakota. Just downstream from a cluster of Mandan and Hidatsa villages, these native communities had long established permanent earth lodge settlements along the river, agriculturally rich, socially sophisticated, and strategically placed. The Mandan were already seasoned diplomats, having hosted French, British, and Spanish traders. The Americans were just the latest strangers with strange hats here. Lewis and Clark ordered the men to build a winter fort, Fort Mandan, named in honor of their hosts. It rose from the frozen prairie like a wooden statement of intent. They were here to stay, at least until spring. Constructed of cottonwood logs, the fort featured high walls, blockhouses, and cramped rooms for over 30 men. It was more drafty than comfortable, but it kept the howling winds at bay, and those winds were merciless. Temperatures often plunged below 0 Fahrenheit. Frostbite was a daily threat. Yet life inside Fort Mandan was far from idle. Lewis and Clark were obsessively recording data, everything from temperature readings to tribal languages to the exact number of corn kernels in a local cob. Crucially, it was at Fort Mandan that they met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper, and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Though Charbonneau was hired as a translator, it was Sacagawea, pregnant at the time, who would become an indispensable guide in the months ahead. Her knowledge of Western geography and ability to communicate with native tribes would prove more valuable than any musket or map. Relations with the Mandan were mostly peaceful, though tensions occasionally rose. Cultural misunderstandings, resource scarcity, and sheer proximity made friction inevitable. Still, the Corps knew that without native cooperation, their mission could end right there in the snow. By spring 1805, with journals full, gear repaired, and Sacagawea's newborn son, Jean-Baptiste, swaddled and ready, the Corps dismantled Fort Mandan. The next phase of the journey into the unknown, beyond the plains and toward the Rockies, was about to begin in April 1805. The Corps of Discovery left behind the relative safety of Fort Mandan and re-entered the unpredictable wild. They now traveled lighter, with a smaller party and more urgency. The winter's lull was over. Ahead lay mountains, uncharted rivers, and the question that haunted Jefferson's plan: was there a water route to the Pacific? Spring brought beauty, but also blood-sucking torment. The Missouri River teemed with mosquitoes, which harassed the men relentlessly. Sleep was interrupted by swarms. Bison, deer, and bear became more plentiful, yes, but so did blistering sunburn, swollen insect bites, and maddening humidity. Lewis noted it all in his journal, his tone somewhere between scientific curiosity and mild suffering. It was during this stretch that the expedition experienced its first near disaster. While attempting to retrieve a capsized pirogue, Sacagawea calmly rescued critical items, including Clark's journals and maps, earning even deeper respect from the men. She wasn't just a translator, she was a stabilizing force, cool under pressure, adaptable, and fiercely capable. By June, the Corps reached the Great Falls of Missouri. Not one, but a series of 5 waterfalls stretching across 18 miles. It was a magnificent natural wonder, and an absolute nightmare to portage. The men spent nearly a month hauling boats and supplies overland around steep cliffs and jagged terrain, using homemade carts and brute strength. Some called it the expedition's most physically grueling challenge. Still, spirits lifted when Lewis spotted the snow-capped Rockies in the distance. That moment, though awe-inspiring, also brought dread. The team had assumed the Rockies would be like the gentle Appalachians. They were not. These were monstrous peaks that would soon dash all hopes of a continuous river route to the Pacific. But hope came in the form of Sacagawea's people, the Shoshone. When the Corps finally made contact, an astonishing reunion unfolded. The chief, Kamiaway, turned out to be Sacagawea's brother. That moment, equal parts luck and legend, shifted everything. The Shoshone agreed to provide horses, supplies, and guides crucial for the expedition to cross the Bitterroot Mountains where no boat could go. The Missouri had taken them as far as it could. Now the real climb began. Crossing the Rocky Mountains was never going to be easy, but even the most pessimistic predictions couldn't prepare the Corps of Discovery for the brutal reality of the Bitterroot Range. With the Missouri River behind them and the Pacific still far ahead, the expedition now had to abandon their boats and march on horseback, hauling what they could over narrow, icy trails. Armed with Shoshone horses and guides, the Corps began their trek across the Bitterroot Mountains in early September 1805. The terrain was merciless. Jagged ridges, steep ravines, and thick forest made every step a battle. The trails were often nothing more than game paths winding through fog, snow, and wind-blasted passes. But the worst enemy? Hunger. The game was nearly non-existent. The men resorted to eating candles, soup made from bear fat, and even horse meat. Journals from this period become haunted by food, reduced to grim catalogs of what was edible and what was simply desperation. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Their moccasins disintegrated. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes. One of the most harrowing sections was Lolo Pass, where the party trudged through snow drifts while gnawing on boiled roots and shredded hides. Clark wrote that they were entirely out of provisions and subsisting on horse meat. It was quite simply the lowest physical point of the entire journey. And yet, somehow they didn't give up. When they emerged from the mountains near present-day Idaho, the Corps stumbled into the lands of the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce could have easily wiped them out, but instead they nursed the starving men back to health, offered fish and karma's root, and even helped them construct canoes to continue their journey west by river. It was another miraculous turn of fate, another reminder of indigenous hospitality, not just American grit, made this expedition possible. While resting with the Nez Perce, Lewis and Clark reflected on what lay ahead. They were battered, frostbitten, and malnourished, but now within reach of the Columbia River Basin. And that meant one thing. The Pacific was near, but the worst wasn't over. The rivers were wild, the weather unpredictable, and winter was close behind, with the Rocky Mountains behind them and winter closing in. The Corps of Discovery began building dugout canoes from towering ponderosa pines, thanks to Nez Perce assistance. Their next target? The Columbia River, the mighty waterway that would carry them toward the Pacific Ocean, the end of their long, painful march. But if they thought paddling would be easier than mountain crossing, they were in for a wet, violent surprise. The Columbia was no lazy river. It was fast, rocky, and moody, and at times seemed to fight their very existence. The canoes were heavy and often unstable, especially with the full weight of gear, journals, specimens, and human exhaustion. Treacherous rapids threatened to flip boats and drown precious cargo. More than once, men nearly died. Only quick reflexes and sheer luck kept the expedition from losing everything. Along the way, they encountered several Chinookan and Sahaptin-speaking tribes, whose societies were rich in trade, especially in salmon, a staple food that swam in impossible abundance. The Corps marveled at the fishing methods, carved plank houses, and detailed canoes. These tribes were savvy, experienced, and wary of newcomers. Diplomacy remained delicate. Some tribes welcomed the strangers. Others viewed them as unwanted intruders, inching closer to their world the farther they traveled. The more the environment transformed. Rain fell with merciless regularity. The lush forests of what is now Washington and Oregon were beautiful, but cold, damp, and utterly relentless. Clothing molded. Gunpowder became unreliable. The journals of Lewis and Clark during this period read like diaries from a soggy purgatory. Finally, in mid-November 1805, after 18 months of hardship, the Corps reached the mouth of the Columbia River, and there, through the gray stormy mist, they caught their first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. The moment should have been triumphant, but it was anything but romantic. Their camp, hastily constructed near present-day Astoria, Oregon, was a muddy mess of wind and despair. They named the site Fort Clatsop, and they would spend a long, wet winter there. Cold, sick, and plagued by fleas, they spent their days making moccasins, boiling elk meat, and writing page after page of journals. They had made it, but the hardest truth now stared them down. They still had to go back. Reaching the Pacific Ocean in November 1805 should have marked a victory lap for the Corps of Discovery, but the ocean was not in a festive mood. Torrential rain, freezing temperatures, and relentless coastal storms turned their reward into a damp, muddy nightmare. With little choice, the expedition built a crude shelter on the south side of the Columbia River, naming it Fort Clatsop after the local Clatsop tribe. The winter of 1805-1806 was brutal. It rained every single day except for 12, according to Clark's notes. The men's clothing rotted, lice and fleas ran rampant, and scurvy loomed. Elk, their primary food source, had to be hunted daily, often miles from camp. The meat was tough, lean, and barely enough to keep body and morale from collapsing, despite the discomfort. Lewis and Clark insisted on continued documentation. They detailed tribal customs, geography, weather, plants, and animals, adding hundreds of pages to the scientific record. Lewis meticulously described sea otters, while Clark improved the maps that would later guide generations of settlers. Even in misery, they remained obsessive observers. Interactions with local tribes were mixed. The Clatsop and Chinook peoples were accomplished traders with long-standing networks up and down the coast. They were polite, but not particularly enthusiastic about the cause's presence. Negotiations over food or supplies often involved stern bargaining, not friendly hospitality. Unlike the Mandan or Nez Perce, these coastal tribes expected reciprocity and didn't mind showing impatience when the Americans offered less than impressive trade goods. And then there was boredom. Trapped in a fort made of soggy logs, waiting for the weather to break, the men passed time making salt, mending clothes, and carving wooden souvenirs. Spirits ran low. Illness spread. Even Lewis, usually the steely-eyed scientist, grew irritable and withdrawn. By March 1806, the Corps had had enough, with journals overflowing, samples preserved. And their bodies are damp and stiff from months of hardship. They burned candles for the last time at Fort Clatsop, packed what little hadn't rotted, and turned their faces eastward. They had found the Pacific. Now came the real test, surviving the long, punishing return to civilization without the awe of the unknown, only the memory of every painful step ahead. In March 1806, the Corps of Discovery left Fort Clatsop with soaked clothing, exhausted bodies, and a singular goal: get home. They had accomplished what no other Americans had, reaching the Pacific overland. But the journey back would prove just as perilous. just as draining and in some ways more complex. The wilderness they had once entered with curiosity now loomed with a different energy, familiar but still unforgiving. They retraced their steps up the Columbia River, struggling once again with high currents, steep cliffs, and tense interactions with native tribes. Supplies ran low. Trade was difficult. The Chinook and other coastal tribes had grown even more cautious, perhaps sensing that the Americans' presence heralded a wave of changes they didn't welcome. By late spring, the Corps made it back across the Bitterroot Mountains with better weather and smarter preparation this time, though still a grueling test. When they reached the Nez Perce villages, they were welcomed like old friends. The tribe had safely kept their horses as promised and helped the Corps prepare for the next leg of the journey. Then Lewis and Clark made a bold decision. They would split the expedition into smaller groups to explore more territory. Lewis headed in toward the Marias River, hoping to map its connection to the Missouri and extend U.S. territorial claims. Clark followed the Yellowstone River, charting its course and searching for easier routes through the plains. It was a risky move. Communication between groups was impossible, and Lewis's path turned nearly fatal. In late July, Lewis's group encountered Blackfeet warriors, who initially appeared friendly but grew suspicious when they saw the Americans' firearms and trade goods. One tense night turned deadly. A skirmish broke out, and 2 Blackfeet men were killed. The only violent deaths caused by the expedition. Lewis's party fled under cover of darkness, shaken and wounded. Clark's group had a slightly less dramatic return, though not without its share of injuries and bison stampedes. They built canoes, reunited with Sacagawea and her family, and navigated Yellowstone with relative success. By August 1806, the 2 groups reunited near the Missouri River. The expedition was whole again, but the mood was somber. The thrill of discovery had passed. Now came the final grinding paddle home, tired, scarred, but alive. By late August 1806, the Missouri River once again pulled the Corps of Discovery downstream, this time carrying them toward home. Not a mystery. Their bodies were thinner, their uniforms in tatters, and their journals swollen with mud-stained pages. But they survived. On September 23, 1806, the expedition finally returned to St. Louis, greeted not with fanfare, but with stunned awe. Many had presumed them dead. In just over 2 years, Lewis and Clark had traveled over 8,000 miles, crossed mountains, navigated roaring rivers, made contact with more than 50 native tribes, and recorded hundreds of new plant and animal species. They had mapped vast portions of the continent. With astonishing accuracy and established a firm American presence in lands long claimed by indigenous nations Britain and Spain, the expedition was hailed as a triumph. Newspapers celebrated their survival and discoveries. President Jefferson, who had watched anxiously for news, was elated. Yet despite their heroic status, Lewis and Clark's fates diverged sharply after their return. Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, but struggled with depression, alcoholism, and debt. Just 3 years after the expedition in 1809, he died under mysterious circumstances, either by suicide or murder, at a remote inn along the Natchez Trace. His loss cast a shadow over the mission he had once led with such precision and purpose. William Clark, on the other hand, thrived. He became governor of the Missouri Territory, superintendent of Indian affairs, and remained an influential voice in Western expansion for decades. He named his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a tribute to his fallen friend and partner. And what of Sacagawea and York? Sacagawea returned W with her husband and child. Her exact fate is debated, but her symbolic role in American memory only grew. York, Clark's enslaved servant, had become a legend among the native tribes, but despite his contributions, Clark refused to free him for many years, a painful irony that history would not forget. The expedition's legacy is both heroic and complicated. It opened the West to further exploration, trade, and settlement, but also laid the groundwork for the displacement of native peoples whose lands had been mapped without consent. The story of Lewis and Clark. It is not just one of survival or discovery. It is a story of ambition, resilience, cultural collision, and the high cost of manifest destiny. It reminds us that to explore is human, but to understand what's been changed in the process, that's the real journey.